Before we begin, let's slow everything down. You're not here to learn dates, or memorize rules, or keep track of every name. This channel exists for quiet watching, for long stories told gently from a distance where nothing is urgent. We walk through strange worlds and broken timelines the way Prismo watches them from the center of time. Calmly, patiently, letting moments unfold without rushing them. If you're still awake and you want more journeys like this waiting for you later, you can quietly subscribe or leave a like, a small signal to keep these timelines playing. And if you're already drifting, that's perfect. Let's begin. The river is leaving, not in a flood, not in rage. Just backing away from its own city at dusk, like a guest who has quietly decided not to stay the night. The harbour that once drank ships whole now exhales them out, leaving hulls tilted on their sides like sleeping animals in a field of slow glistening mud. Ropes hang slack, masts lean, the waterline retreats grain by grain, and the kingdom that rose on its back watches its god turn its face away. On the docks, torches go out one by one, not blown, not doused. They simply burn down to the last orange breath and then surrender, leaving behind the thick, faintly bitter smell of extinguished pitch and charred wood. The air tastes of silt and old fish and wet rope. Somewhere a board creaks, then another, until the empty harbour sings a slow, arthritic chorus. Above it all, stars appear in the shallowing water, their reflections broken and restitched by ripples that do not care about trade, or power, or the last desperate wishes of a small king on a darkening balcony. He is not dying in battle. He is not watching enemies breach the walls. He is watching absence. A trade route has bent a few miles to the left, following deeper channels and safer currents. And that quiet correction in the map has more power than any siege engine. Here is the thing. In the universe of kingdoms, you do not always fall because someone pushes you. Sometimes you just are not visited anymore. Think about that for a second. The river was once a god here. Priests read its moods in the height of the flood, in the color of the water, in the way driftwood spun in little vortices near the piers. Now it shrugs and moves its timeline elsewhere, abandoning this harbor the way a cloud abandons a hill. No curse, no prophecy, just the slow unmaking of reality by silence. The warehouses stay full because no one comes to empty them. The coins stay stacked because no one comes to trade. The city is still standing, but its existence is already past tense. And this is only one candle on the edge of empire. There were hilltop citadels that ruled a single mountain pass, rich on tolls, until a new road pierced a different valley. Desert oases that were tiny blue miracles in a sea of sand, thriving until the dunes shifted and the water sank out of reach. Island harbors that woke up one morning to find the sea had climbed a little higher and simply not gone back down. Hundreds of these micro-realms, flickering all along the borders of great empires, went dark without anyone at the center of time writing their names down. In this video, we're going to walk through those forgotten kingdoms the way you walk through a dream you half remember in the morning. We'll follow rivers that changed their minds, roads that bent away, winds that rewrote coastlines, and the quiet cosmic rules that decide which crowns get remembered and which dissolve into mud and legend. As you drift towards sleep, we're going to relight these lost places for a moment in your mind, let their docks creak again, their torches flare once more, and then, gently, we'll let them fade back into the dark where they have always been waiting. What we're remembering tonight, the scope of forgotten kingdoms. There were once kingdoms so small and quiet that history forgot to write their names. But tonight, we're going to give them a few minutes at the center of time. Before you fall asleep, think of this as a slow tour through the backstage of the universe, where the props have been left out, the crowns are chipped, and the audience went home thousands of years ago. Here is the thing. When people say lost kingdoms, your brain usually jumps to the loud ones. Atlantis, fallen empires, collapsing marble. But in this video, we're going to explore the complete story of forgotten kingdoms that ended more like a candle going out than a palace explosion. River realms buried in mud when the water shifted a few miles to the left. Hilltop citadels and mountain micro-kingdoms erased by one landslide and a few centuries of weather. Oasis chains swallowed by dunes and abandoned when caravans chose a different well. Islands drowned by rising seas and volcanic tantrums. City-states that survive only as distorted legends and misread maps. Their golden towers, probably just two-story mud brick houses with decent views. These quiet realms matter. They matter because they reveal how fragile power really is, how geography and climate can dethrone kings more surely than armies or revolutions. A hill kingdom that once controlled a narrow mountain pass thrives on tolls, on merchants forced to bow and pay. Then someone carves a new road through the next valley, and suddenly that proud little reality loses its leverage. No invasion, no epic battle, just a different route on a trader's map, and the crown becomes an heirloom nobody wants. And beneath all of that, they tell us something about memory. Memory is not a fair archive. It is a nervous librarian, over-caffeinated, misplacing entire countries because the scroll labels fell off. Some river civilizations are pressed under layers of flood mud like flowers in the earth, perfectly preserved and completely unread. Some legendary cities, when archaeologists finally find them, turn out to have been small practical towns that later stories inflated into cosmic metropolises. Think about that for a second. A port that once smelled like fish and wet rope becomes, in the multiverse of human imagination, a shining gate to another timeline. Emotionally, this is a video about the loneliness of empty throne rooms, about the heartbreak of rulers who believed their names would last forever, who imagined their power as permanent reality, not as a temporary wish whispered into the universe. There is sadness there. Resignation, the tenderness of realizing that most human stories, even the royal ones, end with a whisper, not a shout. Let's start to frame it in that specifically Adventure Time way. These kingdoms live in the space between permanence and forgetting, between map and myth, between stone walls and shifting sand. They are like glitches on the edge of a cosmic interface, flickering between you existed and no record found. As we move on, we'll drift from the concrete archaeological clues, dried riverbeds, drowned harbors, into more philosophical terrain. What does it mean for a place to be forgotten? What does it mean, uncomfortably, when that place is a person? We'll keep the pace gentle, sleep-friendly, like walking slowly through ruins at dusk. But the questions will keep a tiny candle lit in the back of your mind as you fade. Your map for the night, how we'll drift through lost realms. So here is the thing. To keep all of this from feeling like a random slideshow of ruins, you and I need a quiet map. Not a map with borders and flags, but a map of how the night will move, how your attention can drift and return without ever feeling lost in the dark. Let's start at the water. We're going to begin with the river kingdoms, the realms that rose and fell with channels of mud-brown water that refused to stay in one place. Imagine a city whose whole existence depends on a bend in a river, on boats docking at its silted harbor, on trade routes that pass exactly here and not 5 miles away. We'll step into a day in that reality. Fishermen at dawn, scribes counting grain at noon, a queen watching the flood marks on a palace wall. Then, gently, we'll watch the river move, a drought that lasts a lifetime, a flood that lays down a quiet grave of mud. The power goes out not with a battle, but with a slow turning of the current. Think about that for a second. From there, we climb. Hilltop citadels and mountain micro-kingdoms come next, each one ruling a single pass, a single stone throat through which caravans must travel. We'll see guards at a gate that is the whole universe to them, a king whose crown only covers one valley, a new road carved through the next ravine over, a landslide in the wrong year, and an entire timeline of toll collectors and border disputes just stops. In this video of the mind, our pattern stays the same. The physical setting, a day in their existence, the slow forces that unmake them, and the way their memory collapses into a stray legend about bandits in the mountains. Then we cross into the desert, oasis realms that flicker along caravan routes, kingdoms built around one improbable pool of water. We'll listen to merchants bargaining at dusk, to priests reading the sky for rain that will not come. The trade roads bend, dunes walk forward, the last well goes salty. An entire reality gets buried under sand and mispronounced names on maps. After that, the islands, little maritime powers undone by storms, rising seas, and volcanic moods. Harbours full of sails, then harbours full of silence. Finally, we'll arrive at the city-states that survive only as myths and misread charts at the edge of the multiverse of old atlases. Along the way, we'll pause. We'll ask how many forgotten crowns lie under your own city, under your own house, whether the place you live might one day be a rumor, a wish in someone else's bedtime story, and at the end, all these rivers, roads, dunes, and shorelines will fold back into one soft reflection on impermanence, less like a lecture, more like falling slowly through time. Get cozy in the archive, inviting you into the quiet corners of history, so before we go wading into those rivers and dunes and hilltop ruins, this is the moment where you get to do the opposite of archaeology. You don't have to dig, you just have to sink. Let's start with your body, which has been carrying you around this whole day like a very patient pack animal in the multiverse of errands. Adjust the pillows behind you or under your knees, or in that oddly specific place your spine keeps filing complaints about. Dim the lights, or turn them off completely so the room becomes its own quiet universe, with your screen as the only small star. If you can, set your device down where you don't have to hold it, so your hands can finally retire from scrolling through timelines, and just rest. This is not a test. There are no rules you have to remember. Here is the thing. This corner of the internet is designed to be low effort on your side and strangely high effort on mine. You don't need to take notes on ancient river kingdoms while you're half asleep. You can let the names blur, the dates dissolve, the borders melt like coastlines on an old overfolded map. If you drift in and out, that's not a failure, that's the point. And while we're here, hovering between waking and sleep, we're going to do the smallest, laziest form of interaction. If you already know you like falling asleep to long, quiet stories about lost places and fragile power, you might tap like or subscribe now while you're still awake enough to remember which side of the screen is which. Think about that for a second. One tiny gesture now, and future you doesn't have to fumble around half dreaming, trying to find this little harbour again. Because this channel is its own tiny kingdom, a pocket realm in the algorithm, somewhere off the main road of viral chaos, where forgotten stories gather like exiled courtiers. In that specifically Adventure Time way, it lives and dies by attention, but it does not want to shout for it. Your engagement is like a small lantern on the city wall, just enough light to keep this place from vanishing under the digital dunes. You should also know the rules of this realm. There will be no sudden loud shifts, no jump cuts that feel like someone yanking you across the universe by the collar. Not here, not tonight. Just a steady contemplative flow, like a river kingdom that never floods, that lets you float in and out as sleep approaches, without punishing you for missing a line. So as you settle, imagine your bed as a hilltop at the center of time, looking down over a great dark map of the world at night. Each forgotten kingdom is a faint, flickering light on that map, a wish in the distance that we're about to visit together. When you're ready, eyes heavy, body quiet, we'll walk down from this hill and step into the first of those lights, between river and dust, framing forgotten kingdoms as living tension as we step into that first faint light. Here is the thing. Every forgotten kingdom we're going to visit tonight lived in a tension. Not just political tension, not just who's wearing the fanciest hat, but a physical, geographic tightrope stretched across the map, between river and dust, between mountain and plain, between the known road and the blank, unpromised space beyond. Let's start with the rivers. Imagine a city that believes the river is its destiny, its personal cosmic wish, flowing past the walls. Inside, the king walks marble halls as if he owns time itself. Outside, the water is already thinking about leaving. A few degrees of climate, a century of silt, a quiet decision the river makes in the night to braid into new channels, and that absolute seeming power collapses into mud. The palace becomes a sandbar. The royal harbour becomes a field where reeds write their own soft, unreadable laws. Now shift your attention uphill to the mountains. There were hilltop citadels that ruled a single pass, a single narrow cut through stone where caravans had to file in like beads on a string. The ruler of that pass could feel like the center of time, as if the multiverse itself had to squeeze past their toll gate. But the rock is older than any crown. One landslide, one new road chiseled through a different valley, and that cosmic feeling of control evaporates. The pass is still there. The power is not. Down in the deserts, you get the same pattern, just written in sand. A queen of one oasis, a council of elders around one spring, believing that as long as water rises from that hidden source, their reality is secure. Think about that for a second. Inside the walls, they debate taxes and succession. Outside, the aquifer is quietly lowering. The dunes are rehearsing the shape of the city they will one day erase. No invasion, no last stand, just a slow exhale of moisture from the earth. On coasts and islands, it's harbors instead of springs. A sheltered bay that once caught every trade wind, every desire moving across the sea, becomes obsolete when the main route slides a few miles away. The council still meets. The warehouses still wait. But the masts on the horizon choose another line on the water, and the universe does not send a memo explaining why. So in this video, the real protagonist isn't any one king or queen. It's climate, it's trade, it's memory. Those quiet, impersonal forces that reshape maps while rulers sleep and scribes sharpen their pens. Authority feels infinite from the throne room. From the perspective of the river, the road, the wind, it barely registers as a blip on the timeline. As you drift, we're going to hold that tension like a soft thread. Every time we meet a new kingdom, we'll ask what it was balanced between and what tiny shift finally tipped it into forgetting. Was it a diverted caravan? A century of drought? A story that no one bothered to repeat out loud? When you know what a realm was clinging to, you can feel the exact moment the map quietly let go, drawing the first coastline. How we know about kingdoms history forgot when the map lets go. Something else quietly takes over. The ground starts keeping score. Rivers, wind, ash, and mud become the archivists of a universe that doesn't care about royal titles, only about weight and water and time. Here is the thing. Most forgotten kingdoms are not remembered by their names at all. They're remembered by patterns. Let's start with the easiest pattern to imagine, because you've seen it in puddles and sandcastles. Layers. Archaeologists read the Earth the way Prismo reads timelines on his wall of screens. One layer after another, stacked and flickering. A burned floor, a collapsed wall, a layer of mud, from a flood that happened before anyone alive can remember. You don't see the king's face. You see the same house rebuilt 3, 4, 5 times in the same place, each version slightly different, like a wish being rephrased across centuries. Along an old riverbank, they don't find a sign saying, "Welcome to the kingdom of whatever." They find shards of pottery clustered where a market used to be, broken in the exact pattern you get when people drop bowls near doorways. From the air, they see faint outlines of walls, rectangles and circles pressed into fields, the ghost geometry of a town that once believed it was the center of time, now politely sharing space with wheat. Rivers are the real power here. A river can abandon a city the way a distracted god abandons a universe. Not with anger, just with a quiet, decisive turn. Channels shift, harbors silt up, and whole river kingdoms end up buried under meters of fine mud, preserved like pressed flowers. Think about that for a second. A palace roof becomes the floor of the next age. New houses grow on top. Centuries later, someone buys an apartment, never knowing their bedroom is directly above an ancient throne room where another person once worried about taxes and rainfall. We're going to meet hilltop citadels that slid under landslides, oasis realms swallowed by dunes, when trade routes moved 10 miles left, island polities nibbled away by rising seas and storms. But the paper trail they left behind is often deeply confused. Medieval scribes copy names they don't recognize, turning one valley kingdom into 3 different spellings. Cartographers draw phantom islands and misplaced cities because a sailor heard a rumor about a long-dead port, and, well, the map had an empty corner. So in this video, what we're doing is not a greatest hits compilation of Atlantis, El Dorado, and the usual celebrity lost cities. Those are loud. We're interested in the quiet ones. The tiny, plausible, often nameless polities that slipped through the cracks of written history, but still dented reality enough to leave a pattern in the ground, or a smudge on a manuscript, or a coastline that bends wrong for no obvious reason. And because the multiverse of Forgotten Realms is crowded, some of the kingdoms you'll hear about tonight will be composites. They are narrative wishes granted from real evidence, river mud here, a misread map there, a ruined wall on a lonely hill, woven together into a single sleepy portrait. Not to trick you. To help you see the broader phenomenon as clearly as if you were floating above it all in a cosmic living room, watching timelines of cities flicker on a wall of screens, each one lighting up for a moment and then going dark. And when one blinks out, another glows underneath it. When rivers decide, the rise of the mud-born kingdoms, and when one blinks out, another glows underneath it. Let's start with one of those faint lights, a wide, slow river in deep antiquity, moving across its plain like a creature half asleep. It doesn't run in a straight line. It braids and unbraids itself, loops in lazy arcs, abandons one channel to carve another. From above, it would look almost deliberate, like handwriting across the earth. Down on the ground, it just feels like reality breathing in mud and water. Here is the thing. Every time that river hesitates, every time it throws a new curve or leaves behind an old bed, it writes the outline of a kingdom, a crescent of darker soil where last year's flood forgot to leave, a subtle rise where silt has piled for centuries. People notice. They drag reed boats onto the bank, plant barley in the damp fringe, and suddenly there is a village holding onto the edge of the current, pretending it has tamed the universe just because the harvest is good for a few generations. Control the right 20 meters of that river, and you control everything that tries to cross it. Think about that for a second. Not an empire, not a continent. Just a shallow ford where wagon wheels don't drown, or a narrow pinch where a single ferry can shuttle people from one timeline of their lives to another. A family builds a raft, then a dock, then a toll booth, then a market grows on both banks, because it's easier to pay the toll than walk 3 days upstream. One day, someone nails a bit of coloured cloth above the door and calls it a palace. We're going to call it a capital, but it never called itself that. Most of these mud-born realms didn't have grand cosmic titles. They were the city by the bend, the houses at the ford, the lord of the crossing, names that were really just directions muttered to travellers. Local fame, no multiverse footprint. No scribe in a distant marble hall ever wrote them into the official timeline of kings. They existed, they taxed, they argued about irrigation rules, and then they went quiet. Season after season, the river performed its slow ritual of power. In generous years, it spilled over politely, laying down a thin golden grey film of silt that turned fields into granaries and granaries into vaults. Surplus grain meant clay tablets, hired guards, and tiny river-scented courts debating whose wish for more canals would be granted. Then, a decade would arrive when the water forgot the script. Floods came early or not at all. Channels jumped their banks and carved new paths through sleeping orchards. Irrigation ditches, laid out with almost mathematical devotion, suddenly led nowhere. A king could wake up rich and go to bed ruling only over wet reeds and a broken quay. And here is where the quiet horror lives, because just as the river could lift a ferrymaster into a crown, it could, with one bored meander, strand his harbour in a dead lagoon. A bend straightens, a channel clogs with invisible centuries of mud, and the city by the crossing finds itself watching an empty, glittering distance where the water used to be. Trade walks away to a new ford. The palace becomes a barn. The crown becomes an heirloom, then a paperweight, then a lump of metal buried in silt. If a river can make a kingdom vanish by moving a few body lengths to the left, what happens when it moves even further? We'll follow one of those abandoned channels next to see what else it quietly erased. The city of two harbours, a river kingdom that lost its water, so follow that abandoned channel downstream in your mind, and you reach a place where the river once hesitated. It split, briefly unsure, and in that moment of watery indecision, a kingdom slipped in. A small city, stone and mud brick, built on the fork where the current divided into two bright arms, each curving around a low island like protective hands. They called it the City of Two Harbours, and its king, modest but not that modest, styled himself the Lord of Both Waters. Let's start at its height, when the river still believed in it. Picture shallow draft boats nosing into each harbour, hulls painted with eyes to watch the current, decks piled with grain, wool, jars of oil. Warehouses lean over the quays, stacked with sacks and amphorae and clay tablets. Shelves of pressed mud recording who owes what to whom. Scribes sit cross-legged in the shade, reeds scratching symbols that will outlive their own bodies, tracking a whole miniature universe of trade in careful lines. Children race along the docks, daring each other to leap the gaps, flinging pebbles at passing barges, until a boatman yells and they scatter, laughing. Priests in faded linen stand at marked stones on the bank, measuring the river's height with a string and a memory. They watch the water the way astronomers watch the sky, as if the level itself is a mood, a wish, a cryptic sentence from a god. Here is the thing. In their reality, it is. As long as the river flows around both sides of their island, the city feels inevitable, like a fixed point in time. We're going to stay with them as that illusion unravels. Upstream, where no one in the city ever goes, a minor earthquake shrugs a hillside loose. Just a landslide, just a few thousand tons of rock nudging the current a little closer to one bank. No omens, no trumpet of doom, just a quiet edit to the script of the river. Think about that for a second. An entire kingdom's future rewritten by a slope having a bad day. Years pass, one channel begins to slow. Silt, which had always been a background character, starts demanding lines. The eastern harbour grows shallower, reeds appear where deep water used to be. Boatmen complain that their keels scrape the bottom. Traders mutter about delays. They still come, because habit is powerful, because every timeline of their lives has run through these twin harbours. Then the western arm thins too, not dying, just losing interest. Farther away, a new, deeper bend of the river gathers more of the flow, and merchants quietly redraw their maps. The city of two harbours wakes up one spring to discover it is a city of inconvenient detours. The response is frantic and strangely dignified. The Lord of both waters orders canals dug, trenches hacked through mud and gravel to coax the current back, as if arguing with gravity. Men waist deep in murky pits swear that if they cut just one more channel, the river will remember them. Priests multiply the offerings, casting barley and incense, and once an entire bronze mirror into the shallows, trying to bribe a god that only speaks hydraulics. Officials invent new rules. If the river will not bring caravans, they will tax the overland routes that skirt their fading wharves. They raise gates, they weigh carts, they stamp clay tokens with seals that used to mean maritime power and now mean, at best, mild inconvenience. It almost works. Almost. But wagons can choose a different road. Boats cannot choose a different depth. Warehouses empty slowly enough that no one can say the exact year it became obvious. One closes and becomes a granary. Another becomes a shrine. Another collapses and quietly rejoins the dust. The quays fall silent at midday, echoing only with the clack of a distant loom, the bark of a dog chasing nothing in particular. And then there is the last ruler. His title still says Lord of Both Waters, but the river no longer bothers to correct him. At dusk he walks the old docks, planks warped and nailed down over air. Below, where hulls once knocked and ropes once creaked, there is only cracked mud and wind combing through dry reeds. He pauses at the mooring stones, their grooves polished by 1,000 vanished ropes, and listens for a sound that reality no longer makes. No invasion, no grand collapse, just a city quietly backing away from the river as the river backs away from it. Within a few generations, it is a small inland town with a large, inexplicable quay. Within a few centuries, it is a wrinkle beneath fields, a layer of compacted mud and brick, waiting for some future archaeologist to misread it as a great maritime capital. In that specifically Adventure Time way, the universe has moved on, leaving only a title, Lord of Both Waters, with no waters to rule. And if one fork of the river could abandon a king like that, what did the new main channel find downstream? In the next part, we'll walk with that deeper current to the empire it accidentally made possible, and the old gods it quietly drowned, buried like pressed flowers. River civilizations under the fields. The river did not just make an empire, it also made a graveyard. As that deeper current found its new capital downstream, it carried something else with it. Silt, patience, and the quiet power to press whole kingdoms flat, like flowers between the pages of the earth. Here is the thing. Rivers are archivists with terrible handwriting. Every flood season, the water spills over its banks, slows down, and drops its load of fine mud over everything that does not move. One flood is a nuisance. 10 floods are a renovation. 100 floods, after the last priest has left and the last market stall has closed, become a burial. Walls are not knocked down, they are gently swallowed. Courtyards fill, doorways become half-height, streets turn into shallow canals and then vanish entirely under a level, polite sheet of silt. Above that, new farmers arrive, see flat ground, and say, "Sure, let's start a village here." If you could slice that village in half, like a cake, you'd see the secret. Archaeologists call it a tell, an artificial mound that looks like a natural hill until someone puts a trench into its side and time itself opens. At the very bottom, the earliest huts, reed and mud, the first experiment in staying put. Above them, a thicker band where the town became a small kingdom, with brick walls, a palace that is really just a slightly fancier house, maybe a tiny temple to a river god whose name we will never read. Above that, centuries of rebuilding and collapse, floors over floors, each one a forgotten chapter. Burn layer, rebuild, flood layer, rebuild, someone's kitchen balanced directly on top of someone else's throne room. Think about that for a second. You could be standing in a modern wheat field, and beneath your shoes there might be 5, 10, 20 lives of the same city, stacked like alternate timelines that never knew about each other. In some parts of the real-world Fertile Crescent, farmers plow over ancient palaces without realizing it, the tips of old columns just barely surfacing after heavy rains, like fingers testing the air. The tractor hits a carved stone, the driver swears, moves it aside, and keeps going, completely unaware he's just nudged the doorway of a forgotten audience hall. And here's the pattern interrupt. We're going to admit that a lot of those river kingdoms are effectively anonymous. We can map their streets, trace their granaries, even see where someone once kept jars of sesame oil, but their names, dynasties and myths have dissolved. The ink is gone. The language might not even be recognizable as a language anymore. What survives is the architecture of daily life: door widths, oven shapes, drainage channels. Reality has kept the tutorial level and deleted the lore. In this video of the planet's buried timelines, you and I are walking over them constantly. Your bus route might cross an old processional road. Your quiet residential street might be paved directly above a royal avenue that once hosted coronations and laments. How many forgotten capitals lie under the ordinary towns you've driven through, their royal roads now lined with parked cars and porch lights, with no idea what lies below? Somewhere, at the center of time for that little universe of mud, brick and reeds, a king is still technically in session, pressed flat under meters of river memory. And downstream, the current is already looking for its next experiment in power, its next city to raise, and then, eventually, to tuck gently under the fields. When roads turn away the kingdom that lost its travelers downstream, the river is still auditioning new favorites, but up above the floodplain, another experiment in power is already underway. Not with water this time, but with footsteps, with wheels, with the long, slow pulse of caravans moving through the dark like a second man-made river. Let's start on a hill that never drowns, a steep, rocky spine rising above a shallow ford where the river can be walked and where for a few centuries in one small universe every road seems to converge. On the crown of that hill, a ring of walls. Inside the ring, a town that exists almost entirely for people who do not live there. Inns pressed shoulder to shoulder, stables breathing in hay and breathing out steam. Market stalls that bloom at dawn and vanish by dusk, like time-lapse flowers made of wool and copper. Here is the thing. This kingdom's power is not in fields or fleets, but in interruption. You cannot cross the river without passing its gate. You cannot pass the gate without paying something. A coin, a story, a rumor about bandits 3 valleys away. The king calls himself guardian of the road, and on paper that sounds noble, almost cosmic, as if he is personally defending the timeline of commerce itself. In practice, it means he has watchtowers every few miles, way stations with watered troughs and thin soup, and a modest but steady stream of silver from every wagon, every pack animal, every wandering merchant who wishes to keep moving. From above, if you could stand at the center of time for this little hilltop, you'd see it like veins glowing in the dusk. Torches along the road, lanterns at each curve, a constellation not in the sky, but laid across the earth to guide desire from one horizon to the other. And the king is proud, walking his walls at night, listening to the creak of axles and the mutter of traders in 10 languages. He is not rich. He is not grand. He is simply necessary, which in any universe may be the most intoxicating power of all. But roads, like rivers, have their own quiet rebellions. One year, a neighboring valley finally clears its bandits for good. Another, an ambitious duke downstream, spends a fortune on a stone bridge that bites into both banks and refuses to wash away each spring. The new route is shorter, flatter, safer. It does not need the hill. At first, the change is almost invisible. A few fewer carts in the morning queue. One innkeeper muttering that market day felt light this week. Then, slowly, the rhythm of reality shifts. Lanterns that once burned all night to welcome late caravans are left dark to save oil. Stable boys stand outside with nothing to groom but their own boredom. Market days shrink. The bright chaos of spices and fabrics collapses into a few stubborn tables of onions and iron nails. The king reacts the only way he knows. He lowers the tolls, then lowers them again, then waives them entirely for anyone willing to swear they will still use the king's good road. Think about that for a second. A guardian of the road begging travelers not to take the better path, as if pleading with the multiverse to ignore efficiency and honor habit. We're going to stay with him, just for a breath, on the evening when the decline becomes undeniable. The gate that once jammed at dusk with arguing drovers now swings on its hinges in a wind that has no witnesses. The captain of the guard, out of practice, forgets to call for it to be closed. No one reminds him. No one is trying to get in. Outside the walls, the road already looks tired. Grass tests the edges, then the center, like a quiet coup against the idea of passage itself. Wagon ruts soften. A single late traveler pauses, squints up at the open gate, and chooses the new bridge instead. Inside, the king stands in his watchtower, staring at an empty curve of road that used to be his whole reason for existing. And somewhere beyond the next ridge, another hill, another town is already rehearsing how it will inherit his travelers, his coins, his stories, without ever knowing his name. The hill that watched empires pass, micro-kingdoms of the high places. So the road bends away, the last traveler chooses the new bridge, and that lonely watchtower king is left staring at an absence. Now, lift your gaze with him. The flat river plains fall away behind you, and the world begins to wrinkle and fold until the land is all ribs and vertebrae. A great spine of rock with tiny stone citadels clinging to it like barnacles on the back of some sleeping cosmic beast. Let's start in the high passes, where the air thins and the rules of distance change. Down on the plains, a kingdom might stretch for days of walking. Up here, power can be measured in minutes of climb. One narrow defile, one knife-edge ridge, one valley that funnels every traveler between two cliffs. Here is the thing. If you control that single gap, you can call yourself a king. A few hundred soldiers, a walled town pressed into a ledge, terraces like careful handwriting on the slope, and a ruler whose universe extends exactly as far as their watchtowers can see. Think about that for a second. Everyone in the realm can see the castle from their doorway, if the mist lifts. Everyone knows the king by sight, not as a face on coins, but as the person who walks the same goat paths and coughs in the same winter air. Borders are not abstract lines on a map. They are a certain boulder with a crack like a lightning bolt, a stream that runs loud in spring and thin in late summer, a twisted pine where the patrols turn back. The whole kingdom fits neatly inside one horizon. You could stand on the highest tower, spin slowly, and name almost every roof below. From the perspective of the empires in the valleys, These micro-kingdoms hardly counted as realities at all. On some grand imperial tablet, a hill realm that lived entirely off tolls from a single pass might be recorded as local lord, or not recorded at all. A dynasty that lasted 200 years up here could be in the archives of the lowlands, a footnote wedged between tax reforms and a minor border correction. In the multiverse of human timelines, they were treated like toll booths, not sovereign universes of desire and law. And yet the mountains themselves remember differently. Rock has its own slow, patient power. A landslide spills down one wet spring and buries the old road under a permanent avalanche of broken time. An avalanche tears away the outer wall. A century of tiny earthquakes shifts the safest path to the opposite side of the ridge, and suddenly every caravan's wish bends towards a new valley. The citadel that once sat at the center of time for its people becomes an offshoot, then an afterthought, then a rumor. No siege, no last stand, just a gradual silence. We're going to keep climbing, but notice what's left behind. Faint terraces fading into scrub, a staircase that ends in open air, a broken wall no taller than your knee, holding back nothing. The kings are gone, the tolls forgotten, the records indifferent, but the slope still carries the outline of their existence, like a half-erased sketch. And beyond this ridge, higher still, the mountains are about to show you that they can swallow entire worlds and leave almost nothing at all. The pass of 1,000 footsteps, a kingdom erased by a landslide. So you follow that half-erased sketch up the slope, and the path tightens until it is barely wider than your shoulders, pressed between a cliff that leans over you like a closing eyelid, and a drop that falls away into cloud. The air is thin, the silence has weight, and above you, anchored to the rock like a barnacle on the hull of the universe, there is a small stone fortress watching the pass the way a patient hawk watches a field. Let's start with the road itself. It is not grand, it is not paved in marble or lined with statues. It is just a narrow, cliff-edged ribbon of reality, scratched into the mountain face by generations of hands and hooves, carrying traders with jingling mules, pilgrims with tired feet, and messengers who run because time is always late. On one side, a valley of orchards and river kingdoms. On the other, a valley of salt lakes and distant glittering ports. This pass is the hinge between them, the keyhole in the door between worlds. Above it, the fortress. One tower, a low wall, a courtyard no bigger than a village square. Here is the thing. For the people who live here, this is the center of time. Every caravan is a tick. Every returning pilgrim, a tock. They count caravans like other kingdoms count stars. They collect modest tolls. Grain, coins, a bolt of cloth, a rumor about some war far away, and they light signal fires when the weather turns, orange flares against incoming snow, telling the valleys the road is dangerous but open. Daily life is small, but it hums. A scribe notes how many mules pass in a season. Children learn to tell the origin of a traveler by the smell of their packs. The ruler, wearing a crown that is mostly practical fur and not much power, stands on the parapet and says, with real pride, that they are the key between worlds. Think about that for a second. Your entire existence bound to a single line of stone, your authority measured in footsteps. And then, 1 year, the rhythm changes. At first, it is just rain that will not stop. Not a dramatic storm, just a steady, patient insistence, like the universe tapping one finger against the mountain. Rivulets worm into cracks, roots drink too deeply. Or, in another telling, there are tremors, small shivers underfoot that rattle bowls and send dust drifting from the ceiling at night. Nothing collapses. Nothing explodes. The mountain simply loosens. Rocks begin to fall. Not boulders the size of houses, Not yet. First, fist-sized stones that skitter across the path and bounce into the void. Then slabs that shear away from the cliff, leaving raw pale scars in the dark face of the rock. The guardians of the pass send workers to clear it. They tether themselves with ropes. They pry and shovel and push. We're going to keep it open, they say. This is what we do. But time has other rules. Each month, the falls grow worse. A switchback vanishes under a fresh cone of scree. A sheltering overhang collapses, taking with it a shrine that had watched the path for centuries. The signal fires burn more often now, not as reassurance, but as warning. The toll ledger thins. On some days, no footsteps at all. Travelers, being practical, begin to whisper about a different way. There is a longer route over a neighboring ridge, higher, colder, but more stable, where the rock is older and less interested in rearranging itself. One merchant tries it and lives. Another follows. Within a handful of seasons, the caravans that once queued beneath the fortress like a river of color have become a trickle, then a memory. No one wishes this. It is just that desire follows safety and routes follow desire. Up in the fortress, they watch the empty road. They lower the tolls. They offer warm beds, safe escort, blessings from 3 imported gods. It does not matter. You cannot tax a silence. You cannot light a signal fire for a universe that has already taken a different path. Eventually, the last messenger comes through, hurrying, eyes wide, saying that in the lowlands they are already drawing new maps. The old pass is being left off. The ruler of the pass listens, nods, and, in a gesture that is both dignified and faintly absurd, insists on collecting the toll anyway. Rules are rules. After that, the mountain finishes what it began. Another wet season. Another sequence of slow motion collapses. One morning, a whole section of the path is simply gone, replaced by a chaotic tumble of boulders that do not care about history. The gate of the fortress now opens onto a dead end of stone. The key between worlds no longer fits any lock. Centuries pass. The orchards in one valley belong to someone else now. The salt lakes in the other reflect new flags. Up here, the fortress is half buried in scree, its tower a broken tooth in a jaw of grey. Goats climb where guards once stood. Snow drifts through the old toll room. The ledger, if it survived at all, is just a compressed smear in the sediment of time. In the villages far below, people still tell a story, mostly to children who do not believe in maps older than their grandparents. They speak of a road that used to go through the mountain, watched by a hawkstone fortress where a small king counted every step in the universe as if it were treasure. In that specifically Adventure Time way, the legend has grown stranger than the reality. Some say the road moved itself out of boredom, that the mountain got tired of being walked on and shrugged. But if you stand on the newer, safer ridge, and you look across at that scarred slope, you can see it. The faint line of the old path, the outline of the gate, the echo of a kingdom that lived entirely on footsteps, a realm that did not fall to war or plague or cosmic catastrophe, but to the quiet, patient decision of travelers to place their wishes and their weight somewhere else. And as you drift towards sleep, we're going to follow those choices down into other forgotten routes, other erased borders, where whole timelines of power and desire vanished the moment the road went another way. Crowns the size of valleys, dozens of kingdoms on one mountain range. And if roads can erase a kingdom, then mountains can multiply them. Let's start by lifting you up, slowly, as if the universe itself is granting you one quiet wish, to float above a mountain range at twilight. The sky is thinning to violet, the last light catching on snow and stone, and below you, scattered along the ribs and folds of rock, are tiny constellations that never make it onto any star map. A ring of lamps here, a crooked ladder of torches climbing a slope there. Each cluster is a town with its own walls, its own king, its own tiny court holding reality together for maybe a few hundred souls. Here is the thing. From up here, it looks like one continuous spine of stone, one single presence on the map. But when you sink down into any given valley, the universe fractures into dozens of separate worlds. One little hilltop fortress that controls a single pass and lives entirely on tolls. Another that rules a plateau with 3 springs and exactly 1 market day, where the greatest political crisis of the decade is whether goats are allowed inside the gate. In some historical regions, there were not just a few of these micro-realms, there were dozens, each holding one corridor through the mountains, each with its own rules, its own timelines of grudges and alliances that never reach the center of time. Never reach the empires who imagine they control everything. Think about that for a second. Somewhere, a great king in a far-off capital is engraving a triumph on stone, listing the mountain peoples he has subdued. To him, these crowns the size of valleys are just names on tribute lists, minor waypoints on a march, interchangeable dots on a border. He is not evil. He is not even particularly interested. He is just bound by power and perspective, and in his records, those dozens of courts collapse into a single word. Highlanders, hillmen, barbarians, whatever label the scribe can fit into the margin. Time keeps moving. We're going to watch centuries pass like clouds. Conquests roll through. One valley king marries his daughter to the next Passover. A landslide buries a road. A new tunnel makes an old toll gate irrelevant. Some kingdoms are swallowed in open war, some in quiet treaties, and some just forget to exist, abandoned when the last family decides the lower plains are easier on their knees. Their palisades rot, their watchtowers fall, their names survive only as a ruined tower on a hill, a stubborn terrace line on a slope, a place name that means fort in a language nobody speaks anymore. Pattern interrupt. Imagine your own hometown as one of those crowns. If it had once been a kingdom, how would you know now? Maybe there's a local festival whose origin story is strangely elaborate for what is, objectively, just an excuse to eat fried dough. Maybe there's a street named after a prince no one can quite place, or a family name that once meant ruler and now just means neighbor. In that specifically Adventure Time way, reality keeps the outline of the wish long after the wisher is gone. The power is spent. The crown has dissolved into everyday life. But the shape of that old desire lingers in the landscape, waiting for someone drifting towards sleep to notice it, and for one quiet moment, remember that whole forgotten kingdom back into existence. The desert's string of lanterns, birth of the oasis realms, and once you notice that lingering outline of an old wish in the hills and rivers, your attention slips outward, further, until the land itself dries out beneath you. The cool stone, the damp earth, the sound of running water, all of that falls away. You open your eyes, still closed in your actual bed, but in your mind you're standing in the dry hush of a night desert, where sound feels like it has to ask permission just to exist. The air is thin and cold now. The warmth is all under your feet, stored in sand that spent the day pretending to be an ocean. Above you, the stars are sharp and overcommitted, punched into the sky like someone took a needle to the fabric of reality. And on the horizon, you see another constellation, not in the heavens, but on the ground, a faint, wavering line of fires, each one an oasis, each one a tiny kingdom of water holding its breath against the universe. Here is the thing about deserts. They look empty, but they are full of rules. A single, reliable well, a spring that does not give up in the dry season, can support a town. Not a grand capital with marble columns, just a ring of mud brick houses, a low wall of thorn branches, a few date palms that remember where the water rises. Add another oasis 3 days away, and another 3 days beyond that, and suddenly you're not just looking at lonely dots, you're looking at a timeline, a route, a loose realm that exists only because caravans decide to move along it. Let's start with one caravan, trudging toward one pool of dark water. Too few caravans, and the town starves on its own silence. The dates rot unpicked, the wells are deep but useless, and the only power left is the memory of when camels used to crowd the gates. Too many caravans, and the water level drops, inch by anxious inch, until the well is less a gift and more a countdown. So these desert realms learn to manage desire like a wishmaster at the center of time, carefully, reluctantly, with ledges and limits, and the occasional very polite threat. Because these kingdoms are not defined by walls. Not really. They are defined by agreements. Who may drink first? How many animals may graze? How long a caravan may linger in the shade before it has to move on? The laws are carved less in stone and more in memory, enforced by the simplest and harshest penalty imaginable. Next time, you do not drink. Think about that for a second. No prison, no dungeon, just a quiet nod from the well keepers, and suddenly the entire multiverse of your possible tomorrows collapses into one short, thirsty line. We're going to follow those agreements as they stretch across the sand, because in that specifically Adventure Time way, the real palace here is invisible. It's made of custom and trust and the shared fear of running out. A council in one oasis might claim lordship over wells a week's journey away, not because they can ride out and enforce it every day, but because everyone agrees that if you break the rules in one place, the water might turn its back on you in all of them. And under all of this, there is a quiet, central vulnerability. A new, deeper well discovered a few days off the old road. A spring that coughs once, then fails over a decade. A mountain pass open to the north, so caravans can skirt the desert entirely. One small change in the trade winds of human desire, and a bustling oasis capital becomes an empty, echoing basin, its date palms standing like patient ghosts around a dry mouth in the earth. Somewhere out there, under a dune, there is a whole forgotten kingdom that was once just a circle of light in the dark, living and dying by the rhythm of footsteps on sand. And as you drift with it, we can turn our gaze even further to the places where the water was never still at all, where the entire realm floated, trembling on the edge of the sea. The well that went quiet, an oasis kingdom left behind. So let's start with a circle of light that didn't stay buried. Not yet. Imagine you crest a low dune at dusk, and the desert suddenly opens into a bowl of green date palms like dark feathers against a violet sky. Low mud brick walls holding in the cool, and at the center, a pool that catches the last light like a fallen piece of the moon. This is not a capital of an empire. This is a mid-sized oasis town, one bright node on a long, tired line of footsteps across the sand. Camels kneel around the water, their reflections wobbling. Lanterns swing from wooden poles, turning steam from cooking pots into tiny clouds. You can hear 3 languages in a single argument, 4 more in the laughter that follows. Traders from the edges of the known universe lean on saddlebags, passing dates and stories back and forth as if both were currency. Here is the thing. In a desert, hospitality is not just kindness, it is power. The ruler of this oasis, call them a king, a sheikh, a queen with dust on her ankles, does not command legions. They command shade. They control the gates, the wells, the safe enclosure of the night. You step through the mud brick walls and you are inside their reality. They ask for taxes. Yes, a small cut of your cargo, but they also ask for news, for rumors from distant timelines of trade, For the prestige of being that name everyone speaks when they plan a crossing. We're going to stop at the palms of so-and-so. We're going to rest at the pool under the lanterns. Think about that for a second. Their crown is basically a really good guest list. And then, one year, the desert blinks. A band of nomads or a rival clan drills deeper into the earth, some distance away. The story will later be told as a miracle, or as clever engineering, or as a wish granted by a patient underground river. But the result is simple: a new well, deeper and colder. The water tastes fresher. The grazing around it is more generous. The caravans do the math. At first, it is just one group choosing the new path, then 3, then 10. The old oasis still glows at night, but the fires are fewer, spaced out like missing teeth. The central pool no longer ripples constantly with the weight of animals and people. Some evenings its surface is a perfect mirror, because no one has touched it in hours. Dates begin to fall unharvested. You can imagine them thudding softly into the dust, a slow, sticky rain of abundance with no hands to catch it. The ruler walks the low wall and counts fewer tents outside the gate. There is no war, no catastrophe, just a quiet rerouting of desire and necessity, the great caravan of history nudging a few miles to the left. Centuries later, the pool is only a shallow depression, a faint scar on the face of the desert. A few stubborn palms still stand, their roots chasing a memory of water. The mud brick walls have slumped into anonymous ridges. From above, the outlines of former streets are barely visible under drifting sand, like veins on an old hand. You could walk across it and never know you'd crossed a kingdom. But here is the question. If a realm can vanish because a well moved, what happens to the kingdoms that never had solid ground at all? Those that floated on waves, or clung to cliffs, or balanced on the edge of fire. Because as the sand closes over this quiet oasis, the story of forgotten crowns is about to tilt toward the sea, and then plunge somewhere even stranger. Caravans, climate, and quiet endings. How the desert forgets so as the sand closes over that quiet oasis, the camera pulls back. You don't just lose a single well, you watch a whole necklace of wells loosen and fall, beads scattering across the desert floor. Here is the thing. Kingdoms almost never vanish alone. They go out as networks, as caravan lines, as fragile constellations of light along a route that the universe quietly redraws. Let's start with the sky, because the sky cheats first. Over centuries, winds drift a little, monsoon tracks slide north or south, temperatures lean warmer or colder, not dramatic in a single human lifetime, just a slightly shorter rainy season, a little less snow in far-off mountains feeding the aquifers. But over 3, 4, 10 generations, the water table sinks. Wells that once rose sweet and cold now scrape up brine. Cisterns refill slower. The same bucket, the same rope, the same wish dropped into the dark. And what comes back tastes wrong. A city of palms can survive one bad year, maybe 10. It cannot negotiate with a 400-year drought. Time does not care about your royal bloodlines. The rules of evaporation are older than any crown, so the palms thin, the gardens are abandoned in layers, from the outermost to the inner courtyards, like a universe shrinking around a single stubborn pool. And when that last pool turns to salt, the king doesn't need to be overthrown. He just needs to be thirsty. But climate is only half the plot. The other half is movement. Somewhere far away, a harbour silts up, or a clever sailor figures out how to ride a new current, and suddenly the centre of time for trade shifts. Sea routes open or close, and caravan masters redraw their maps. A road that once pulsed with camels carrying incense and lapis and gossip becomes the long, quiet path no one can afford to take. Think about that for a second. A kingdom can do everything right locally and still starve because someone improved a ship. When the caravans stop, the oasis doesn't explode. It just exhales. Inns stand empty. Warehouses echo. A generation later, people pull down the wooden doors for firewood. Another generation, and the wind takes a turn at architecture. It sands the inscriptions off the gate, rounds the wall tops into low sleeping mounds. Courtyards fill with drifts. From above, in some cosmic survey of forgotten timelines, the city becomes a slightly different shade of beige. Future archaeologists will get almost nothing. A line of buried foundations, a concentration of broken pottery, maybe a faint ring where the city wall once ran, like the memory of a wish pressed into the skin of reality. They will argue over whether this was a kingdom or just a large village, as if the people who lived there would have cared about the category. And out in the desert, the story survives better than the stone. Around campfires, people talk about the city of palms, or the well of kings, or the place where the sand sings at night. They disagree about where it was. They disagree about whether it ever existed in this universe at all. In that specifically Adventure Time way, the legend gets bigger as the evidence gets smaller. The less we can point to on a map, the more power the tale has in the multiverse of memory. Pattern interrupt time. Imagine a modern highway rest stop. Fluorescent lights, vending machines, that mysterious locked door marked employees only. Now jump the timeline forward 1,000 years. No maintenance, no cars, just weather. The roof collapses first. Glass crazes, then falls. Plants split the asphalt into slow black rivers. From a distance, it's just a low hump in a field. Up close, an archaeologist finds a fossilized coffee cup, a tangle of rebar, a rectangle of concrete that once held a bathroom stall. What clues would remain that this was an oasis of motion, a place where people paused between long stretches of emptiness and refilled their tiny personal universes with caffeine and fuel? Maybe a line of strange, regular holes where gas pumps once stood. Maybe a concentration of microplastics in the soil. Maybe nothing obvious at all. And yet for you, right now, that rest stop is real, vivid, almost annoyingly mundane. That's the gap we're going to keep walking into tonight. The distance between how solid a place feels when you are there and how quietly it can evaporate from the record. Because as the desert forgets and the roads reroute and the wells go sour, there are other edges of existence where water is not the problem at all. The next forgotten crowns will rise where the waves never sleep and where the horizon itself keeps changing the rules. Islands on the edge of the map, the liminal kingdoms of the sea. So the deserts fall silent and the roads peel away, and you think the story is drifting inland. But here is the thing. Some forgotten crowns were never on land to begin with. They were scattered out where the map frays, where ink turns into waves. Before you fall asleep, let's start by standing at the rail of an imaginary ship. At dusk, the sea turned to dark glass, and ahead of you, a chain of islands rises out of the blue like a broken necklace. On each island, there is almost the same scene, repeating like a quiet pattern in the multiverse. A small harbour, a crooked pier, a watchtower with a tired lantern, and a cluster of homes pressed close together, their windows glowing. Those lights tremble in the water, reflections stretched and torn by the tide until they look like scattered constellations that have slipped out of the sky. You can hear oars knocking, a rope sliding over wood, someone laughing once and then not again. These places are tiny. They are not empires, and yet, in that specifically Adventure Time way, they hold a strange kind of power. Control a good anchorage, a sheltered bay where storms break their teeth on outer reefs, or a narrow strait between two rocky teeth of land, and a fishing village wakes up one morning as a maritime micro-kingdom. One day you are mending nets, the next you are collecting tolls from passing ships, hiring pilots who know the hidden sandbars by heart, sending out 3 whole boats and calling it a fleet. We're going to linger on that scale for a moment, because it matters. These were realms that ruled maybe a harbour, maybe a ring of reefs, maybe just the safest curve of shoreline within a day's rowing. Think about that for a second. An entire royal lineage built on the fact that their bay was less terrible in a storm than the bay next door. Their reality, their sense of cosmic importance, hung on the angle of a coastline and the depth of a channel. But island power is precarious. It depends on sea levels that stay politely where they are, on storms that follow old rules, on trade routes that still need your harbour as a stepping stone across the water. Raise the sea a little, and the harbour wall drowns. Drop it, and the port is stranded in mud, ships marooned high and dry like embarrassed whales. Let a river change its mouth, or a new canal carve an easier line through the map, and the tolls vanish. The pilots have no one to guide. The little fleets rot at their moorings. From a distance in time, though, memory does something very different. A scribe hears about a king who taxed every ship that passed between 2 rocks, and by the time the story reaches a distant court, that modest harbour has become a golden city rising straight out of the sea. A queen who commanded 3 fishing boats becomes mistress of 1,000 war galleys. The practical island polities inflate, wish-like, into legendary sea realms where palaces shine and waves obey the crown. The universe loves to exaggerate when no one is around to correct it. And then the coastlines themselves start to move. A volcanic cough raises an island, leaving the old pier stranded far above the surf. A century of storms throws sand into a channel until the harbour silts shut. Somewhere else, the sea creeps higher, swallowing the lower streets step by step, until only the watchtower remembers there was ever a kingdom here at all. No invasion, no grand finale, just water and time and the quiet erasure of usefulness. So as you drift towards sleep, hold that image of island lights floating on dark water, never entirely fixed, always at risk of slipping under, because the next stories we're going to follow are not just about cities swallowed whole by the sea, but about ports abandoned when the shoreline betrayed them, about quays left stranded in fields, about maps that still show harbours where only waves remain. The kingdoms on the edge of the map were always living on a moving border, and in the next part of this night's timeline, we'll walk those edges more closely, listening for the last echoes of their tides. The harbour that rose from the sea, an island kingdom stranded on land. So let's start with a harbour that forgot how to be a harbour. Imagine an island that was once nothing but arrival and departure. The air is thick with salt and tar, gulls wheel over masts, and every alley runs downhill as if the whole town is leaning toward the docks in anticipation. Shipyards ring the crescent bay like teeth, taverns overflow with sailors' songs, and dice on warped tables. And at the highest point of the quay, there is a small hall where a small ruler calls himself, without irony, Lord of the Anchorage. Here is the thing. His crown is basically a harbour master's cap with better embroidery. His power is not cosmic, it's practical. He controls the mooring fees, the warehouse keys, the rules about who can unload at night. In this tiny universe of ropes and lanterns, that is enough. His existence is measured in tides and manifests, in the way the town's entire reality bends around the wish for one more good season of trade. But the multiverse does not negotiate with titles. Beneath the island, the crust is rising by a hand's breadth a century, or maybe the sea itself is withdrawing, pulled away along some other timeline by slow climate shifts. The mechanism doesn't matter as much as the effect. Coastlines can move without storms or drama, just a quiet mismatch between water and land, year after year, until a shallow bay becomes a marsh, and then a memory. At first, no one cares. Ships anchor a little farther out. The Lord of the Anchorage adds a line to the harbour rules about longer gangplanks. Children joke that the sea is shy, but the mudflats lengthen. Boats drag their keels, then their rudders, then simply stop coming all the way in. Think about that for a second. Your whole kingdom is built around the meeting point of hull and stone, and that meeting point is walking away from you in slow motion. We're going to stay with that slowness because it is more devastating than any sudden wave. The shipwrights start designing shallower drafts, then give up and take commissions to build doors and rafters instead of ribs and masts. Fishermen leave their skiffs rotting at the last reachable inlet and learn, slightly resentfully, how to read the weather of wheat instead of waves. The taverns replace sea shanties with harvest songs that never quite fit the acoustics of low ceilings stained by decades of pipe smoke and brine. Trade finds a deeper harbour on the next island over, as trade always does. The lord of the anchorage sends beacons and envoys, offers exemptions and desperate little political wishes to any captain who will still call his port first. Fewer and fewer do. His title begins to sound like a joke told at the wrong time. He is not evil. He is not even indifferent. He is just bound by a geography that has quietly revoked his authority. Generations pass. The town tilts inward, away from the absent sea. Nets become curtains. Buoys become garden ornaments. The old stone quay, once the center of time for this miniature maritime universe, stands alone in a field where cabbages and rye sway in a wind that used to carry salt. Children climb its edge as if it were a low, mossy wall, because to them, that is all it has ever been. Centuries later, if you walked there at dusk, you would see a line of dressed stone cutting through grass, leading nowhere, stopping abruptly as if the timeline itself had been edited. The sea is a distant glimmer on the horizon now, a thin silver thought. No ships answer any beacons, because there are no beacons left to answer. And yet, in that specifically Adventure Time way, you can almost feel the ghost of a harbour pressing against the air, as if reality remembers a function it no longer performs and is waiting, patiently, to be asked what vanished kingdom came next. Storms, stories, and sinking coasts. How islands become myths, so imagine that ghost harbour taking a breath. One long, slow inhale. And then the universe answers with weather. Let's start with the violent version, because your brain loves a little drama before it powers down. A low island, barely rising from the sea, a ring of palms and a single stone pier. The air is thick, the horizon strangely straight. Out beyond the reef, the ocean is already rearranging itself, quietly stacking power. You do not need a cosmic lich to wish for extinction here. You just need a storm that refuses to follow the usual rules. The wave arrives not as a wall, but as a decision. It lifts the harbour stones like dice. It scrapes boats across the land like someone erasing a sketch. Fields are salted in a single afternoon. Wells turned brackish. The thin line between land and water redrawn by hand. Survivors climb to the highest ridge they can find and watch their reality dissolve into white foam. Think about that for a second. An entire coastline rewritten in one bad evening. Here is the thing. Not every island vanishes with that kind of theatrical exit. Some drown slowly, almost politely. Year by year, tide by tide, the sea just keeps staying a little longer. A fishing shed loses its foundation. A temple courtyard floods on holidays. A generation later, the grandchildren sail over the old main street and look down through clear water at doorways and steps, and a toppled statue, and the universe has given them a visual metaphor too perfect to ignore. We're going to follow them, drifting above those ruins. From above, a practical town becomes a city. A modest market square, 4 stalls and a shade awning, inflates across the timeline into a plaza of marble colonnades. The single watchtower on the headland grows, in the mouth of a bored sailor at a distant port. into a ring of shining fortresses that could command the whole multiverse of trade. By the time the story reaches a scribe who has never seen the sea, the drowned harbour is a punished kingdom, its people turned into fish for their arrogance. Sailors are not lying exactly. They are doing what Prismo has to do with every wish, taking a messy reality and translating it into a narrative that fits human desire. A rogue wave becomes divine anger, because that makes better sense at the center of time of your own existence. A volcanic eruption that blackened the sky for a summer becomes a god hurling mountains. The moral grows with every retelling. And then, centuries later, an archaeologist in a sun hat and very practical shoes digs under a modern marina and finds the real island. Not a crystal citadel, not a cosmic Atlantis. Just a small, efficient town with clay jars, fish hooks, a tax tablet complaining about dock fees. The grandiose myths and the modest ruins sit side by side, like two competing timelines of the same wish. Somewhere under beach resorts and boardwalks, under infinity pools and cocktail bars, there are old piers serving a new function. Foundations of forgotten capitals, holding up vacation selfies. The islands became myths, but their stones never left. And as you drift further into the story, we're going to follow those stones inland, away from the coasts entirely, to the kingdoms that vanished without ever touching the sea. Cities that became footnotes. The vanishing of modest city-states, so now the stones leave the shoreline and climb inland, and the noise of the waves is replaced by the muffled echo of hooves on packed earth. Carts creaking through gates that are not grand, just adequate. Here is the thing. Most kingdoms were not empires. They were walled towns with a market square, a modest temple, a council hall that smelled like smoke and old arguments, and fields stretching out just far enough that you could still see the city walls if you turned around. Let's start there with those walls, not the colossal world-defining fortifications of epic poems, but the practical ring of brick or stone that said, very politely, "Bandits, please reconsider." Inside, there might be a prince whose crown was more ceremonial hat than cosmic symbol, or a council of elders who ruled over maybe 3 villages, a vineyard, and that one hill everyone kept arguing about. Their power was real inside their narrow orbit, and almost non-existent beyond it. In some valleys, in some river basins, there were dozens of these little urban bubbles sharing the same timeline, each one convinced it was the center of reality. One controlled a bridge, one controlled a ford, another watched over a mountain pass and lived entirely off tolls, until someone centuries later carved a new road through a different valley and turned that proud city-state into a very confused cul-de-sac. Think about that for a second. Your entire existence as a polity depends on which side of the river people feel like walking. Only a handful of these places get promoted into capital H history. They win a war, they birth a poet, they get name-dropped in an epic, and suddenly they're the ones we remember. The rest stay small. They pay tribute to bigger neighbors, send a few soldiers when asked, and then, quietly, they go away. No cosmic catastrophe, no final battle, just drought, or a new trade route, or a slow leak of people to a brighter city downriver. And yet, in the big capitals, in those centers of time and bureaucracy, scribes were still writing their names. Tribute lists, tax rolls, grain deliveries, a careful line of ink that says, essentially, yes, this place existed, and it owed us barley. That's it. No myths, no heroic last stand. Just a column in a ledger. They become ghosts in the archives, haunting receipts. Over generations, the multiverse of paperwork shifts. Copyists misread cramped handwriting. Similar city names blur together. 2 towns become 1. 1 town becomes 3. Maps are recopied, and every redraw nudges a dot a little to the left, a little inland, a little off the river that once defined its reality. Eventually, some cities just drift off the page. Scholars argue whether they were real places or scribal echoes, whether that one tribute entry is a whole lost universe or just a spelling mistake. And here is the twist. When archaeologists go hunting for the legendary cities of story, following those warped names through time, they sometimes find them. But what they uncover are not glittering metropolises at the center of the cosmos. They find compact, practical towns, a few streets, a small temple, a wall you could walk in an afternoon. The name had grown in the telling. The city had not. In that specifically Adventure Time way, the wish for grandeur inflated the legend, while the actual bricks stayed modest. So as you drift deeper, we're going to walk through a few of those almost forgotten gates into city-states that barely ruled beyond their own horizon, and yet somehow managed to echo, faintly, across the timelines to reach you tonight. The city of misplaced walls, a capital lost in its own legend. Let's start with a name that should have been tiny, but refused to stay that way. Call it Helith, the city of misplaced walls. In the few texts that whisper about it, Helith is always doing something decisive, hosting the treaty that ended a river war, writing wise laws that supposedly flowed out across the multiverse of little kingdoms, like ripples on black water. No one describes its bricks, only its power. Here is the thing. Once a name gets loose from its coordinates, reality stops being the main rule. Helith drifted. One valley pointed to a rounded hill and said, yes, obviously, that is where the city stood. Our grandparents said so. Look, you can still see the outline of the walls if you squint at sunset. 100 miles away, a river town claimed the same honor, insisting that the famous wise laws were drafted in their market square between the fishmongers and the donkey tethering post. Both cannot be right, but for centuries both were. Over time, every region along that frontier adopted Helith like a stray wish. A hilltop citadel that had once guarded a toll road decided its broken gate must have been Helith's northern arch. A cluster of mud brick houses near a silted harbour rebranded their ancestors as Helith's legendary merchants, even though the surviving ledgers show mostly grain salt and the occasional very unimpressed goat. Think about that for a second. The same floating name, stapled to half a dozen timelines, each community quietly editing reality to give themselves a cameo in a story about wise laws and decisive battles. And then the archaeologists arrived with their total buzzkill of measuring tapes and stratigraphy. They followed a different rule. Pottery before pride, soil layers instead of legends. In a flat, wind-gnawed field between those rival claims, they found it. Not on the dramatic hill, not by the glamorous river, just a low rise where the plough snagged on old stone. Helith, in the dust, finally pinned back to coordinates. What they uncovered was a small, well-planned town. Sturdy, but unremarkable walls, knee-high when first traced, nothing like the towering battlements the stories promised. Streets laid out with practical care, angled to catch the wind and drain the rain. Houses with 3 rooms, not 30. Clay tablets about barley rations and boundary disputes. A modest shrine where someone had once left a little stone bird, its beak chipped, its wings uneven, as if the sculptor had been called away to deal with a leaking roof. No golden thrones, no cosmic center of time. Just people trying to exist, to survive another season, to keep the walls patched and the arguments written down instead of fought out. There is a quiet poignancy in that mismatch. For centuries, the real Helith was buried, literally pressed into the earth like a folded letter no one opened. The imagined Helith, meanwhile, grew taller and brighter with every retelling, until it towered over the universe of minor city-states like a mirage of power and desire. And then, one afternoon, under a pale sun, the two met in a trench only a few meters deep. Legend peered down. Brick peered up. Which one feels more real to you? Because if Haleth's walls could wander like that, if its name could attach itself to the wrong hills and the wrong rivers for 1,000 years, we're going to have to ask an unsettling question as you drift further. How many other crowns on old maps are quietly sitting on the wrong heads, waiting for a shovel, a broken pot, or a misread inscription to move them again? Maps that dream, phantom cities, ghost kingdoms, and cartographic myths. So here is the thing. Once you admit that crowns can slide from hill to hill on the page, you also have to admit that whole kingdoms can be born there too. Not in stone or river mud, but in ink. You're looking at a map and you think you're seeing reality, but you're really seeing a conversation between guesses, gossip, and very tired men with quills. Let's start with the cartographers, before the satellites, before the neat digital grids that pretend to know every street. They sat at the edge of the known world, at the center of time as they understood it, and they had to fill the blank spaces somehow. So they listened to sailors who miscounted days, to merchants who mixed one harbor with another, to older maps that were already wrong, a half-heard port name, a smudged coastline, a traveler's wish to make his journey sound more impressive. Think about that for a second. Those became coordinates. A scribbled note in the margin, island seen here perhaps, turns into a perfect little circle on the next map, labelled confidently, shaded proudly. A rumour of a kingdom beyond the desert becomes a coloured patch, a neat border, a decorative crown. No one has actually been there. But on paper, in this tiny multiverse of parchment, it now has borders, neighbours, and a future. It has diplomatic problems, and these cartographic ghosts don't vanish quickly. They persist, century after century, recopied like a spell no one remembers how to cast, but no one dares erase. A phantom island off a stormy coast, visited only by sea monsters and printing errors. A misplaced town that drifts gradually inland as each mapmaker corrects the shoreline, but never questions the dot. Somewhere, a real fishing village that inspired it has already washed away, while its ink shadow still exists, stubborn and dry. Here is the inversion that feels almost cosmic. Some real kingdoms, river realms swallowed by silt, hilltop citadels erased by landslides, oasis towns abandoned when the trade routes bent a few miles, leave no mark on the grand atlases. They lived, taxed, argued, loved, and then dissolved back into the earth with barely a line. Meanwhile, certain drawn kingdoms never existed outside ink and imagination, but they influenced expeditions, treaties, even wars. A miscopied coastline can redirect a fleet. A non-existent strait can rewire a timeline. Pattern interrupt for your sleepy brain. Imagine a future archivist, long after our servers have rusted and our satellites have fallen, trying to reconstruct our world. They dig through corrupted files, half-loaded map tiles, glitching GPS logs. A streaming error freezes a corporate campus into an endless sprawl. A brief data bug paints a shipping lane as bright land, and patiently, dutifully, they outline new countries from those mistakes. Data lakes become inland seas. Content delivery networks become trade empires. Someone declares a summit about the sovereignty of buffering province. In that specifically Adventure Time way, the joke hides a quiet question. If their maps say those places exist, if they plan policy and exploration around them, how different is that from a phantom island in 1600? How much of our own universe is already a negotiation between what is there and what we have drawn very confidently on top of it? As you drift, keep that in mind, because next we're going to follow one of those drawn realms as it escapes the paper entirely and walks into legend, becoming a kingdom people swear they remember, even though it was never more than a cartographic rumor. When the weather wears the crown, climate as an unseen conqueror, let's start with that drawn realm walking off the map, because here is the thing. A kingdom does not need an invading army to disappear. Sometimes it just needs the weather to get slightly bored of the arrangement. A river that has been politely flowing past your walls for centuries wakes up one spring and decides, in that specifically Adventure Time way, to take a left turn instead of a right. The capital doesn't burn, it just dries. Quietly. We've already met those river kingdoms, the ones buried under silted harbours and abandoned quays. At the time, they looked like isolated accidents. One unlucky flood, one stubborn sandbar, one port that slowly fills with mud until the last boat gives up. But if you zoom out, if you imagine a wall of cosmic screens at the centre of time, you start to see a pattern. Whole timelines of water bending south, monsoons arriving late, snowpacks shrinking on distant mountains, and every small change echoing through fields and markets and coronations. The same with the desert oases that vanished. On the ground, it feels local. A well runs a little lower each year. The palms yield fewer dates. One caravan skips a season, then another, because a new road has edged a few miles away. But over centuries, that is what a drought looks like from inside a human lifetime. Not a dramatic curse, just one more dry season, one more bad harvest, one more promise that next year will be better, until the desire to stay loses its argument with the reality of leaving. Think about that for a second. For many of these tiny realms, there was no last stand, no final banner torn down in the dust. There was just the slow arithmetic of climate. A hill kingdom that lived on tolls from a snowy pass watches the winters shorten. The ice thins, a new road opens in a neighboring valley, and the power that once felt eternal turns out to be as fragile as a late frost. No villain, no prophecy, just weather, changing the rules without asking permission. And yet, the universe keeps receipts. Climate writes in very small handwriting, in the tight rings of old trees that suddenly narrow for 20 years, in ice cores where layers of trapped air quietly record centuries of volcanic ash and shifting temperatures, in lake sediments that stack mud, pollen, and charcoal into a careful archive of floods, fires, and fields left untended. Modern researchers read those layers like a slow-motion wish log, matching each environmental jolt to a city that thinned out, a harbour that emptied, a palace that never needed replacing. We're going to keep following that trail, because buried in those quiet signatures is a strange comfort. Long after the crowns have rusted and the maps have lied, the weather is still telling the truth. In the next stretch, as you drift deeper into the multiverse of forgotten realms, we'll listen more closely to that impartial diary written in mud and memory, and see what else the wind remembers. Borders that breathe, how trade routes give and take away life. The wind's diary leads us to the borders, because borders are where the weather and the world's desires collide. Let's start with this image. A caravan road at dusk, a line of lanterns bobbing through a narrow valley, and every few miles a gate, a scale, a hand held out for toll. The map shows one line. In reality, it's a river made of hooves and wheels and footsteps. Here is the thing. Trade routes behave like rivers of people and goods, and kingdoms collect wherever the current slows. A ford where wagons have to pause. A mountain pass where snow makes everyone wait. An oasis where water rises close enough to taste. A harbour where the wind finally gives up and ships tuck in for the night. Towns appear first, then walls, then a ruler who claims this bend in the flow as their personal universe. Not because they command cosmic power, but because they control where the line of travelers has to breathe. And just like rivers, those routes meander. We're going to follow one in your mind. Picture a high pass between two ancient valleys, guarded by a hilltop citadel whose entire existence is one long, beautifully bureaucratic pause. Weigh the cargo, stamp the seal, collect the tax, wave the caravan through. For centuries, this tiny realm believes it sits at the center of time, because every important merchant must pass beneath its gatehouse. Think about that for a second. Your whole reality is the queue outside your door. Then somebody invents a better ship, or a new pack animal that can handle a steeper grade. Or they finally carve a more direct road through the next valley over. The river of trade twitches, then shifts. It does not argue. It does not say goodbye. It just finds a faster slope. Overnight, the proud toll kingdom becomes a quiet overlook above an empty road, its rules perfectly intact and perfectly irrelevant. This is the quiet tragedy of small border realms. Many of them exist primarily to manage, tax, or protect these flows. They are not empires of land, but empires of delay. They control the choke points where desire has to stop and catch its breath. That gives them wealth, and for a while it looks like power. But when caravans or fleets choose a different path, that power evaporates with the dust from the last departing wagon. Archaeologists sometimes find whole strings of ruined posts along an abandoned route. Towers, way stations, tiny walled towns, each once ruled by someone who took themselves very seriously while arguing over whose banner got to wave over which bend in the road. Dry cosmic comedy. Dozens of micro-kingdoms all erased by a shortcut. As you drift, let your mind slide to the modern equivalents. Highway exits glowing at night, train junctions, airport hubs that feel like the center of the multiverse when you're trapped in them at 2 a.m. What happens when the highway moves, when the tracks rust, when the planes follow a different sky? In the next stretch, we'll walk through those future ruins before they exist and listen for the faint echo of a boarding call that never comes. Kingdoms under our feet. Modern cities built on ancient thrones, so when the boarding calls go quiet and the highway signs go dark, the story doesn't actually end. It just goes down a level. Because here is the thing. The universe loves a good real estate deal. If a place works once in a timeline, it tends to work again. Near water, at a crossroads, on a defensible hill. The power doesn't vanish, it just changes costumes. Let's start with that. The same coordinates, recycled across centuries, like a cosmic save file being overwritten. A Bronze Age river kingdom chooses a bend in the water where boats can dock and mud is good for bricks. Centuries later, a medieval town piles on top, then an industrial port, then a glass and steel financial district with a coffee chain on every corner. Different rulers, same desire lines. The geography is the throne. The kings are just temporary users logged into the account. In a lot of modern cities, you are walking through those overwritten saves without realizing it. A subway line cuts under a busy market, and the tunnel brushes past the foundations of an old palace, its throne room now a dim smear of stone in fluorescent light. A construction crew digs a parking garage and slices cleanly through an ancient floor, mosaics blinking back at hard hats and safety vests. Time is supposed to be linear, but in these moments it feels stacked, like a multiverse of sidewalks and ceilings occupying the same coordinates. Think about that for a second. Someone eats cereal in a third-floor apartment where, 1,000 years earlier, a queen listened to petitions. Children play video games in what used to be the inner sanctum of a temple. An office worker complains about emails while sitting exactly above a long-vanished market square where traders once argued over salt and glass and the price of a single improbable blue shell. Same spot, different reality. The center of time relocated into your commute. And most of the time, The only acknowledgement of that buried existence is a small plaque you don't read because you're late. A museum display with 3 cracked pots, a rusted coin, and a paragraph that compresses centuries of sovereignty into 50 words and a climate-controlled glass box. Here once stood, and then the entire kingdom is reduced to an arrow on a floor map and a gift shop bookmark. The rules of remembrance are brutal. You get a caption, if you're lucky. Here is the quiet pattern interrupt. What happens when your timeline becomes one of those captions? Imagine your hometown forgotten for 1,000 years, paved over, rebuilt, misremembered. Archaeologists dig through your bus stop, your local bakery, your neighborhood park. Which details do they elevate into legend, and which do they misunderstand completely? Does the late-night burger place become a sacred fire temple of endless offerings? Does a playground slide turn into evidence of a mysterious ritual descent apparatus used by youths to test courage and gravity? We're going to carry that thought forward, because this is how future myths are born, out of parking lots, food courts, and cul-de-sacs. In the next section, we'll follow those buried kingdoms as they stop being ruins and start mutating into stories, watching how a cracked foundation becomes a prophecy and how a lost bus route quietly upgrades itself into a road of heroes. The kingdom of one street. Imagining the smallest possible realm, let's start even smaller than a ruined mall or an abandoned overpass. Pull the camera in, way in, until the entire universe of power and borders and law is just the place you already know best. Your street, your apartment block. The few corners you can walk half asleep without looking up from your phone. Here is the thing. Imagine that is it. That is the kingdom. The borders of sovereignty are the bus stop at one end and the traffic light at the other. Crossing the alley behind the building is technically an international incident. The cracked sidewalk where the weeds push through, that's your contested frontier, the disputed zone on every map in this tiny multiverse of one. In this reality, everyone on your floor, everyone on your block is not just a neighbor. They are citizens, subjects, co-actors in a very small, very serious drama. The person who always parks slightly over the line is now a recurring diplomatic crisis. A parking dispute is elevated to a matter of state, argued with the same intensity ancient kings once reserved for rivers and gold. Think about that for a second. The council convenes not over cosmic war, but over whose cousin keeps blocking the shared driveway. The corner store on the end, that is the royal granary, the strategic resource depot, the beating heart of food security. If the owner closes early, it's a supply chain collapse. The laundromat is the public baths. The mailbox cluster is the central archive. The group chat is the royal court gossip, transmitting decrees and rumors through the timeline of your day. And in this video of the mind, your ruler is not abstract. Maybe it's the landlord, maybe it's the oldest tenant, maybe it's the person who somehow knows everyone's name and Wi-Fi password. They issue unwritten rules about quiet hours and trash days. They wield tiny, precise power over your existence. A signature on a lease, a complaint about noise, a spare key. Not a cosmic god, not a president, just someone whose authority ends exactly where the streetlight changes color. We're going to connect that to history, because this is not just a cute metaphor. There were real micro-kingdoms like this, hilltop towns whose entire rule was one steep road and a wall, harbor cities whose sovereignty was a single curve of shoreline and the warehouses behind it. Valleys where one bridge, one toll gate, one market square made a king feel like the center of time itself. They minted coins, swore oaths, carved their names into stone, convinced that their desire for permanence would echo down every timeline. But if a trade road shifted a few miles, if a new pass opened through a different valley, If a bigger city grew up and swallowed them, their crowns dissolved into neighborhood names. A proud kingdom of one street became the old quarter, then that part of town, then nothing at all. And here is the quiet cosmic joke. A realm you could walk end to end in 3 minutes, once believed it would last forever. Somewhere in the deep past, there really was a kingdom of one street, a complete universe of power and borders compressed into a single dusty road. No one remembers its flag, its laws, or its last worried ruler. But in the next section, we're going to follow that forgotten street kingdom as it falls off the mat entirely and tries to survive as nothing more than a rumor, a misread line on a parchment, a story you hear right before sleep. Reading the rules of vanishing. What forgotten kingdoms have in common? So here is the thing. That one street kingdom isn't an exception, it's the rule written in dust. When you zoom out, when you let your mind drift over all these tiny realms, like a slow camera over a forgotten map, you start to see the same quiet pattern repeating, almost like a cosmic form letter. Small kingdoms usually get one advantage, one pass, one well, one harbor, one crossing. That's their whole wish against the universe. Let's start with the river kingdoms, because they feel the most inevitable. A town grows where the water bends, where boats have to stop, where silt makes a natural harbor. For a few centuries, that bend is the center of time for everyone who matters there. Then the river shifts a little, or silts up or cuts itself a new channel a mile away. The power doesn't explode. It just drains. Think about that for a second. The palace is still standing. The throne is still there. But the boats have quietly decided they live somewhere else now. History almost never gives clean takebacks. Once a river changes course, you can throw labor and prayers and half your remaining treasury at dragging it back, and it will still wander away like a bored god. Trade routes do the same thing. A caravan road steps a few valleys over, a new sea lane opens, and your toll gate kingdom is suddenly a decorative arch in an empty field. They try to reverse it. They build extra walls, extra temples, extra promises. The universe doesn't argue. It just doesn't answer. And yet, there are loopholes, or at least what look like them from inside a human lifetime. A river capital becomes a farming village, its royal avenue downgraded to a road for carts full of onions. A fortress town, no longer needed for war, reinvents itself as a pilgrimage site because someone important allegedly saw a star land on the old battlements. The political existence dies, but the physical place keeps going under a different name, a different timeline, like a minor character who quietly changes shows. Those are the edge cases, the technical survivals. The crown dissolves, but the well stays useful, so people keep coming back with their buckets. And when you compare these kingdoms to the big lost civilization myths, the cursed cities, the magically doomed continents, they feel almost offensively mundane. No dramatic final wish that shatters reality. No volcano swallowing a capital in a single cinematic night, except on rare occasions. Most endings are incremental. A few bad harvests, a generation of drought, a harbor that's suddenly too shallow for the new ships. The power goes out not with a scream, but with a shrug. It starts to feel like there's a cosmic bureaucracy running in the background. No malice, no grand villain, just geography filling out forms in triplicate, climate signing off, timestamping every document and filing it away. The rules are simple and merciless. If your existence depends on one narrow advantage, and that advantage moves on, you don't get an appeal. We're going to follow those rules into the ruins themselves next, the anonymous hilltops and buried riverbeds, where the paperwork of their disappearance is written in stone blocks and broken wells, waiting quietly under your dreams. Lonely thrones and empty roads. The emotional weight of being forgotten, but when you finally reach those ruins, here is the thing. They don't meet you with trumpets or ghosts or cinematic flashbacks. They meet you with an empty room. Let's start in a throne hall that no longer has a throne. Stone steps leading up to a bare platform, their edges rounded by centuries of feet that no longer exist. A thin grey film of dust softening every line. The murals on the walls once shouted victories into the universe, cavalry charges and river battles and treaties sealed at dawn. But the colours have bled into each other until every hero's face looks the same. There is no music, no courtiers, just a silence that feels heavier than any battle scene, pressing down on the air like a forgotten law of reality. There is loneliness here, not dramatic exile on a mountain loneliness, administrative loneliness. The last scribe at a river kingdom's court, still sharpening his reed pens while the harbour outside silts up grain by grain. He copies the royal annals one more time, but there is no apprentice to hand them to, no ally across the water to send them toward. A hilltop queen whose power once depended on tolls from a single mountain pass watches a new road glitter into existence in the next valley and realizes there will be no more envoys, no more seals to break. She is not defeated in battle. She is just removed from the route. Think about that for a second. For everyone inside that kingdom's timeline, this place was the center of time, the center of desire, the axis on which their multiverse spun. Markets opened because the king decreed it. Festivals aligned with the palace calendar. Children learned to draw the outline of their realm the way you might trace your own house. And yet from our vantage point, with our maps and our search bars and our exhausted historians, that same kingdom is a footnote, or worse, an unexcavated mound that tractors drive past on the way to somewhere important. So what does it mean to exist only in the past tense? If no one speaks a kingdom's name, is it gone? Or is it just sleeping in the grammar of the landscape? The river it once taxed still curls through the fields, carrying loanwords downstream into younger languages. The old road, half erased, still decides where the new highway can comfortably run. A desert oasis realm swallowed by dunes still echoes in the way nearby towns pronounce water, or bargain, or king. We're going to stay with that question, but gently, because in that specifically Adventure Time way, there is something almost playfully cosmic about how obscurity works. Power does not vanish, it diffuses. The empty throne room is still shaping reality, just at a lower volume, like a wish whispered into stone instead of shouted at the center of time. And as you drift, you can walk those empty roads with us a little longer, before we follow them outward to the borders where forgotten kingdoms blurred into legend, and then into nothing at all. Stories as second kingdoms, how memory rebuilds what stone cannot. And as those borders blur into legend, something strange happens in the dark. The kingdoms that lost their roads, their rivers, their harbors, begin to quietly lay foundations again, not in stone, but in story. Here is the thing. Reality does not give second chances very often, but memory does. Memory is wildly generous with sequels. Let's start with the rubble. A hilltop citadel that once taxed every caravan in a narrow pass is now just a ring of tumbled blocks and a view. A river kingdom that lived on tolls and silted grain is pressed under layers of mud, like a pressed flower in the earth. A desert oasis realm is buried under dunes because a trade route shifted a few miles to the left. In the physical universe, that is the end of the timeline. The crown falls, the walls crack, the well dries up. But then, some archaeologist finds a shard, a misread map, a half-ruined harbour wall that clearly expected ships that never came back. And suddenly, we're going to rebuild a palace from a broken pot. Not accurately, not completely. But narratively, we take dates, pollen samples, scorch marks, and we grant them a wish. Be a story again. Those stories are not blueprints. They're mood lighting, Myths and legends about these micro-kingdoms exaggerate the power, misplace the borders, and upgrade a practical hill fort into a shimmering city of gold. Yet, emotionally, they hit something true. They remember the isolation of a single valley that thought it was the center of time. They remember the pride of a harbor that believed the whole multiverse passed through its docks. They remember the fear that one drought, one landslide, one quiet change in the rules of trade could erase their existence. Think about that for a second. A forgotten island kingdom might never have had volcano gods in real life, but the legend of an angry mountain swallowing a city preserves a real anxiety. The sense that power here is temporary, that the universe can just pull the ocean a little closer and end your dynasty overnight. In this video, and in every documentary, novel, or long-form deep dive that lingers on lost realms, modern storytelling becomes a kind of soft resurrection. A city-state that lived 3 centuries and then vanished now lives 3 minutes in your mind as you picture it. A mountain pass kingdom that once controlled one road now controls a corridor in your imagination, lined with flickering torches and tax collectors who take payment in attention. Being remembered in stone is rigid. It is one official inscription, one statue, one version. Being remembered in story is different, softer, more mutable. But it travels farther. A carved stele stands in one place. A whispered legend crosses languages, jumps timelines, and ends up here, in your headphones, as you fall asleep. And here is the quiet pattern interrupt. You are not just listening to a story about forgotten kingdoms. You are doing the re-kingdoming. Right now, your brain is allocating mental real estate, prime cognitive property, to a river port that no longer exists. For a few seconds, its docks are more real to you than your own ceiling. In that specifically Adventure Time way, you've granted them a wish, not to come back in stone, but to exist as a small, vivid universe behind your closed eyes. And as we move on, those little realms will fade again, but not to nothing, just to the background hum of places you once visited in the dark, as we follow the road outward to the empires that remembered, misremembered, and sometimes deliberately rewrote them. The quiet power of small places, why tiny kingdoms matter more than empires. So when the empires stride onto the stage with their trumpets and marble and manifest destinies, it's easy to forget that most of reality actually happens off stage in the wings, under bad lighting. Here is the thing. The quiet power of small places is that they hold the same human drama, just compressed, like a whole universe folded into a single alleyway. Let's start with the contrast. Empires love volume. They measure themselves in conquests, in monuments tall enough to bully the horizon, in reforms that claim to reshape time itself. Their timelines are carved into stone, shouted in inscriptions, frozen in arches and domes. But the forgotten kingdoms we're going to drift through tonight lived at a different scale, where history played out at the market well, in the shadow of one hilltop citadel along a single stubborn riverbank. Think about that for a second. An ancient river kingdom disappears, not in a blaze of glory, but because the water quietly changes its mind and wanders a few miles away. Trade routes tilt, harbors silt up. A city that once sat at the center of time for its own people becomes a backwater, then a rumor, then a layer of mud and broken pottery. No final battle, just a slow cosmic shrug. In a mountain valley, a hill kingdom controls one narrow pass, growing rich on tolls and the power to say yes or no to travelers. Then someone, somewhere, cuts a new road through a different gorge, and that proud little realm becomes a dead end. In the desert, an oasis realm survives on a single well, until a century of drought turns that well into a memory. On an island, a king rules a coastline that will not exist once the sea rises a little higher. once the storms carve new outlines into the shore. These are micro-kingdoms, but they are also mirrors. Most of us do not live empire lives. We live valley lives, harbor lives. Lives that make sense only when you zoom in far enough to see the particular soil, the specific river, the exact arrangement of streets and shared desires. Our power is limited in scope, deeply shaped by local conditions, vulnerable to small changes in the rules of our personal timeline. And like those kingdoms, most of what we do will never be recorded in any grand narrative. Yet, if you study these minor polities, a different pattern appears. Not the fireworks of conquest, but the steady pulse of resilience and adaptation. A harbor silts up, so the town pivots to fishing. A road dies, so a village becomes a monastery instead of a market. Sometimes the pivot fails, and the place just stops. Quiet failure, not dramatic collapse. But that quiet is instructive. There is humility in these stories. They remind you that in the multiverse of human existence, almost every crown is made of clay and driftwood, and almost every wish to be remembered forever dissolves into a few broken walls and an unmarked grave. That sounds bleak, but it is also freeing. If even kings vanish into the background, then the value of a life cannot only be measured in how loudly it echoes. In this video, we're going to take that lens and tilt it even closer to you. Because your room, your street, your late night thoughts are also a small kingdom with its own fragile borders. And as you drift further towards sleep, we'll start to explore how the place you inhabit right now might be one of those forgotten kingdoms in waiting, already writing its quiet history in the dark. Your town as tomorrow's legend, imagining future archaeologists at your door. So let's start with something a little unsettling but gentle. Imagine your room, the one you're in right now, without you in it. The air is still. The lights are off. Time keeps moving. Years stack on years until the ceiling sags, the paint peels, the roof finally gives up and lets the rain in. Floorboards soften. Wires rust. Your favorite mug slips from a shelf in some long-ago storm and vanishes into a drift of plaster and dust. Then, more time. Centuries this time, not decades. Your street buckles, trees push through asphalt, your town shrinks to a rumor at the edge of someone else's map. Think about that for a second. The reality you know as permanent is already a temporary layer in the ground. And then, careful hands, a brush, a small trowel. Someone in a future you will never see kneels where your bed used to be and calls it a domestic substructure. They lift that old mug, chipped and stained, and they don't see late-night caffeine or sleepy mornings. They see a ritual vessel associated with dawn ceremonies. They write it down. It goes in a report. Here is the thing. We do this all the time to ancient kingdoms. A parking lot becomes, in their notes, a ceremonial plaza aligned to the sun. Even though for you, it was just the place where you circled for 10 minutes wishing someone would leave. A shopping mall, its roof half collapsed, is catalogued as a palace complex or a central redistribution hub, when in reality, it was pretzels, escalators, and a weirdly aggressive perfume kiosk. We're going to glide over your town like a slow camera now. What survives in this future timeline? Roads fossilize into strange grey rivers. Concrete foundations linger as ghost geometry. Brick, stone, sewer pipes, the heavier bones of your existence stay anchored. But the bright, fast parts of your world, the digital conversations, the memes, the playlists, the late-night searches, the fleeting fashions that felt like they had cosmic power over your desire to belong, those evaporate almost completely. They might find your phone, but not the passwords. They might find a router and call it a household altar to the communication gods. In that specifically Adventure Time way, The joke is that they're wrong and also not entirely wrong at the same time. And this is exactly how we misread those river kingdoms buried in silt, those hilltop citadels erased by landslides, those island realms nibbled away by rising seas. We stand over a few walls and a broken figurine, and we reconstruct a universe of laws, beliefs, and daily routines. We are confident, we publish, but behind every neat diagram was a noisy, messy, ordinary life, not so different from yours. So as you lie there, imagine your town as tomorrow's legend, a lost city in someone else's multiverse documentary. Somewhere far down the line, a quiet voice might be telling your world as a bedtime story, the way we're tracing forgotten kingdoms tonight. And the real cliffhanger is this: which tiny random fragment of your life will become the key artifact that explains everything you never meant to say. Between real and imagined, the blurry line where kingdoms fade into dreams. So here is the thing. Once you start imagining your own town as tomorrow's legend, the border between real and unreal begins to melt a little. You close your eyes, and suddenly a cracked parking lot feels like the courtyard of a vanished palace. A drainage ditch becomes the ghost of an ancient river kingdom, buried under silt and night. Let's start with a quiet problem historians never fully solve. If a kingdom was tiny, brief, and mostly made of mud brick and reed roofs, and if its people told their stories out loud instead of in stone, how different is it, in the long run, from a kingdom that never existed at all? A hilltop citadel that controlled one mountain pass, collecting tolls until a new road cut through the next valley leaves behind a ring of rocks. And a rumor, a legendary realm, leaves behind only the rumor. Think about that for a second. In oral traditions, the gap between those two realities shrinks with every retelling. A modest desert oasis, once just a few wells and a market, becomes in the story a radiant city of glass towers and endless caravans. An island port, really just a ring of wooden docks, is remembered as a cosmic center of time and trade, a place where the whole multiverse supposedly came to bargain. The universe does not correct the exaggeration. Time just nods and lets the tale grow taller. We're going to see this again and again. Some places we file under mythic only probably had small, practical counterparts. Fishing villages behind sea god legends, hill towns hiding inside dragon stories. At the same time, some confidently drawn kingdoms on old maps were nothing but misunderstandings, mistranslations, or political wishful thinking. A scribe mishears a tribal name. A court flatterer inflates a client state into a mighty empire, and suddenly a non-existent crown is ruling a territory that only ever lived in ink. The human mind does not like blank spaces. When you stand by a ruined wall, your perception rushes in to complete the level, like a game engine loading geometry you'll never actually see. You imagine towers, markets, rituals, entire bureaucracies of tax collectors arguing over grain. When you hear of a lost island swallowed by tides and storms, you don't picture a couple of damp warehouses. You conjure palaces, secret rites, maybe a forbidden library with rules about who may enter and what desire brought them there. And in that specifically Adventure Time way, this is where it gets quietly cosmic. Every forgotten kingdom is now part fact, part dream, reconstructed in real time each time someone tells its story or walks among its ruins. The stones hold one timeline, your imagination overlays another. Reality becomes a collaboration between mud, memory, and whatever you happen to wish was true. So as you drift, you're walking along the fading edges of an old map, where the ink thins and someone has drawn little dragons to fill the silence. Ahead, those dragons are about to become even stranger, not beasts, but entire kingdoms that exist only as warnings, metaphors, and bedtime stories, ruling a territory made purely of belief. The soft bureaucracy of time, How the world quietly reassigns its land, those dragon doodles at the edge of the map. The world treats them like paperwork. Because here is the thing. Time behaves less like a roaring conqueror and more like a patient clerk, sitting at a desk in the quiet center of time, slowly updating the world's registry while everyone else is busy pretending they're immortal. No trumpet blasts, no cosmic gavel, just a slow, rhythmic scratching of notes in the margins as rivers shift, roads wander, and names fall out of use like passwords you forgot 3 phones ago. Let's start with the Harbour Kingdom. Once, it ruled the tide line, its power balanced on the rhythm of ships and salt. Then the river silted up. The channel moved a little to the left. Trade routes slipped a few miles away following deeper water and easier wind. No one invaded. No one signed a dramatic decree. The clerk of time simply crossed out Kingdom of the Harbour, wrote Busy Fishing Village, and quietly closed the folder. Years pass, nets fray, children leave, the village becomes the old quarter, a place you cut through on your way to somewhere that matters now. Think about that for a second. Territory hasn't moved. The meaning has. Eventually, storms chew at the shoreline or the sea inches higher, and one winter, the last door slams for the last time. On the map, the clerk erases the label and leaves an empty curve of coast. The land is still there, but administratively, it's been reassigned to silence. This is how hilltop citadels turn into anonymous ridges, how tiny kingdoms built on a single mountain pass lose their tolls when a new road slices through a different valley. No punishment, no moral, just the quiet enforcement of new logistics. Climate leans a little drier, and an oasis realm is slowly swallowed by dunes. Centuries of drought do what no army could. A desert king loses his multiverse of caravans, not because he was wicked, but because the rain ledger changed columns. Maps, languages, and local habits all moonlight as junior clerks in this soft bureaucracy. A legendary river city is buried under layers of flood mud, pressed into the earth like a fossilized wish. Its name survives only as a crooked syllable in a nearby village or as the title of a festival no one can properly explain anymore. A hill once called Crown of the Sky becomes Crow's Hill, then just the hill behind the old road. The paperwork is still there, but it's been photocopied so many times the ink is almost gone. And in this video of the universe filing itself, there's a dry little joke. Some kingdoms get thick folders, epics, chronicles, tourist brochures. Others, they end up as a single sticky note half attached to the back of someone else's empire. Easy to misplace, easy to forget. Still technically on file. We're going to follow a few of those misplaced notes next, into the territories ruled not by walls or rivers, but by warnings, metaphors, and the strange power of being believed in just enough to haunt a bedtime story. Listening to the wind in empty streets, the sensory afterlife of lost realms. But before we walk into those bedtime warnings and half-remembered maps, let's start with something quieter. You standing in what used to be a kingdom, no banners, no crowds. Just wind and the way it moves through broken doorways like it's still rehearsing for the day the gates open again. It whistles through gaps in collapsed roofs, dips into empty courtyards, and pulls a low, hollow note out of a cracked cistern that once held the water for an entire river realm. Here is the thing. The ruins are not silent. They just speak in a slower language. Your footsteps become part of the soundscape. Gravel crunches under your shoes where there were once paved streets, polished by carts and sandals and ceremonial processions. A shard of tile shifts, answering you with a small brittle clink. Above, birds nest in the ribs of a fallen hall, their calls echoing off stone that used to bounce back the voices of judges, merchants, or priests arguing about taxes and cosmic rules. Think about that for a second. The same acoustics that once amplified royal decrees now just make baby bird noises slightly more dramatic. Touch changes everything. Sun-warmed stone holds the day like an old memory, heat seeping into your fingertips when you rest your hand on a toppled column from a hilltop citadel. Lichen has colonized old carvings of kings and river gods, softening their faces into abstract blurs, like the universe itself is slowly redacting the details. In the shade of an alley that no longer leads anywhere important, the air turns cool and faintly damp, carrying the mineral smell of buried cisterns and forgotten wells. Dust motes drift through beams of light in a roofless throne room, hanging there like tiny, indifferent galaxies, suspended in their own private multiverse. There is a strange intimacy in walking through this place. You feel it in the way your body has to negotiate the terrain that other bodies created. A stairway worn down in the middle tells you where feet used to hurry. A low doorway reminds you that someone decided how tall normal was going to be in that particular timeline of existence. You don't know their names, you don't know their desires or their wishes or their arguments about where the border should be, but their decisions still shape the exact angle of your next step. We're going to call this the sensory afterlife of a kingdom. Long after the flags are gone and the chronicles have dissolved into rumors, the way a place feels keeps broadcasting a quiet signal about what mattered here. A desert oasis realm swallowed by dunes still remembers shade. You can feel it in the way the wind drops as you step between two half-buried walls. An island port lost to rising seas leaves behind a line of barnacles on abandoned stone, a tide mark of former power. Is that not a kind of message in the center of time written in texture instead of ink? In this video, we've been treating maps and myths as ways a kingdom survives, but this is another layer. The after image on your skin, in your ears, behind your eyes when you close them. And as you drift towards sleep, these quiet sensations set the stage for one more question. What happens when the only kingdom left is the one that exists purely as a warning, a metaphor, a story you feel more than you believe? Crowns of clay and salt, the humble materials of forgotten power. So when the last echo of those warning kingdoms fades, you're left with a different image. Not a blazing empire on a map, but a faint outline where walls once were. A shallow groove where a moat used to hold dark water. Here is the thing. Most kingdoms were built to vanish, not in a poetic sense, in a very literal mud and timber sense. Let's start with the materials. A lot of these tiny realms along rivers and oases and wind-swept hills weren't carved in marble at the center of time. They were stacked in mud brick, pegged together with timber, roofed with thatch that listened to every storm. Rain doesn't negotiate. Floods don't care about royal decrees. A few bad seasons, a river shifting its course a few hundred meters, and the king's great audience hall just melts back into the ground like it was always pretending to be a hill. Imagine walking through one of those ancient river kingdoms on a clear morning. The palace is basically a well-organized mud rectangle. The city wall is a wooden palisade that creaks in the wind. Banners of dyed wool flap from poles, bright against the sky for maybe a decade before the sun eats them. You have a market, a granary, a temple with painted walls, and yet, from the future's perspective, from our calm little timeline, what survives? A few broken pots, a rusted knife, a hard-packed floor that looks like random geology unless you stare. We're going to borrow an image, crowns of clay and salt, and driftwood, because a lot of rulers weren't wearing solid gold diadems. Their crown was control over a single well in a desert, a pier on a foggy island, a gate on a mountain pass where traders had to stop and pay. Think about that for a second. Your whole cosmic claim to power in the universe is, I decide who drinks here, or I decide whose boat gets to tie up at this rickety dock. It's majestic and a little ridiculous at the same time. Wooden gates rot. driftwood breaks. Salt palaces literally dissolve if the weather is rude for long enough. Fabric rots, pigments flake, carved beams collapse in a quiet, long exhale. What's left is the boring part: foundations, post holes, ash layers, the occasional stubborn brick that refused to follow the rules of erosion. Archaeologists build whole royal chronologies out of pottery shards and trash pits, while the embroidered banners that once shouted a dynasty's existence to the multiverse just don't report in. And yet inside those mud brick halls, people imagined themselves as cosmic anchors. Kings traced the paths of stars. Queens aligned their doorways to solstices. Priests explained that this particular courtyard was the precise center of reality. They felt central to existence, even as termites quietly edited their throne rooms from below. There is a paradox here, a universe of absolute power fantasies wrapped in materials that barely survive one ambitious rainy season. If that feels distant, stay with it for one more moment. Our cities feel permanent. Concrete, steel, glass. Data centers humming like mechanical beehives of desire and information. But concrete crumbles. Steel rusts. Servers blink out. In a few thousand years, our proud skylines might look, from some new perspective, like oddly organized rocks and mysterious plastic fossils. The crowns change, the fragility doesn't. So as you drift deeper into this slow timeline, hold that image of crowns of clay and salt and driftwood, and ask yourself, if even kingdoms built on stone can vanish, what happens to the ones that were never meant to last longer than a story told by firelight, or a single dangerous wish? The mathematics of forgetting. How many kingdoms are missing from our stories? So let's start with a quiet, almost absurd question. If even the stone crowns can crumble, how many crowns of clay and salt and driftwood were there that never even made it into the footnotes? Here is the thing. For every kingdom that gets a glossy spread in your history book, there were others, smaller, quicker, quieter, that flickered for a few seasons of human time and then slipped cleanly out of the record. We're going to do a gentle, bedtime kind of mathematics. Nothing with equations, just proportions. Imagine one of the big, well-documented river kingdoms, the kind that built in stone, wrote on clay and left archives in dry palaces. Around it, like satellites in a miniature multiverse, there would have been hilltop citadels guarding a single pass. Oasis realms wrapped around one dependable spring. Tiny harbour polities that lived or died on a sandbar staying in place. Think about that for a second. The big kingdom is visible because it's shouted in stone. The little ones whispered in wood and mud. Now, every factor that makes a kingdom feel cozy and temporary also makes it vanish. Wood rots. Thatch dissolves. Adobe melts back into the ground in a few seasons of rain. If no one is carving laws into basalt or chiseling royal names into cliff faces, the universe does not keep a backup. A hill kingdom that controlled one narrow mountain road can thrive for centuries on tolls, and then a new path is cut through a different valley, and its power evaporates so gently that even its enemies forget to brag about the victory. There are river kingdoms now buried under mud, their harbours silted over, their streets pressed flat like flowers between layers of flood. There were desert oasis realms swallowed inch by dunes when the wind adjusted its route. There were island kingdoms that trusted the sea, right up until the sea rose a little higher, or a volcano coughed once and rewrote their coastline. None of that feels dramatic from the perspective of cosmic time. It feels like a slow, absent-minded wish being retracted. So how many are missing? We have no precise answer, only a calm, non-technical hunch. Take every famous empire you can name and imagine 10 or 20 or 50 minor neighbors sharing its timeline. Border valleys with their own kings, single cities with their own gods, fishing islands where one ambitious captain declared himself ruler because no one else had filled out the paperwork. It is not hard to reach hundreds. It is not unreasonable to imagine thousands scattered across continents and millennia, each one a brief political experiment in the ongoing lab of human existence. And once you picture that crowd, history stops looking like a neat sequence of great empires marching across a single well-lit timeline. It looks more like the center of time itself, overlapping screens, most of them dark, some of them flickering with forgotten courts and markets and arguments about irrigation rights. The familiar names are just the loudest channels. This doesn't have to feel frustrating. It can feel spacious, comforting even, in that specifically Adventure Time way, where the multiverse is too big to ever be fully known, but you are still allowed to sit with it. As you drift, you can hold the idea that for every kingdom we can name, there were others that lived, loved, argued about taxes, and faded without ceremony. Their absence is not a failure of the record, it is part of the rules of reality. And in the next stretch of this long, slow wish through time, we'll move even closer and imagine what it actually felt like to fall asleep inside one of those tiny, vanishing realms, never knowing it would become invisible. Sleeping kingdoms in language, traces hidden in place names and words. And here is the thing, even when a kingdom falls completely asleep, it doesn't always stop talking. It just lowers its voice, tucks itself into smaller syllables, and hides in the language the way a dream hides in the back of your mind after you wake up. Let's start with the way names shrink. A realm that once claimed a whole valley, a river, a coastline, can collapse down over time until it's only a village name on a weathered sign, or the title of a half-forgotten neighborhood, or a surname someone mumbles at the post office. Power that once stretched across a horizon gets compressed into a mailbox. The royal banner becomes a line on your utility bill. We're going to stay very general here because this is happening in almost every language at once. Old crowns dissolve into ordinary words. A title for an entire mountain kingdom that guarded a single pass might survive only as the name of one hilltop suburb. A desert oasis realm that controlled the water and the caravans might now be nothing more than a bus stop's name, printed in small letters on a route map no one reads all the way through. Those little endings and beginnings on place names, the ones you skim past when you're checking a weather app, used to be clear signals in the political reality of their time. A suffix could mean fortified town, a quiet reminder that there were once walls and watchtowers and people being very serious about taxes. Another could mark a royal domain, land that technically belonged to a distant palace. Another might mean market center, the place where traders from 3 micro-kingdoms argued over grain and gossip. Now, the rules have blurred. The meanings are opaque. Local tongues pronounce the sounds perfectly, while having no idea what power they once announced. Think about that for a second. A word that originally meant King's Hill might now just be the hill, the one where you walk your dog or scroll through your phone. No one remembers the king. The crown has evaporated, but the syllables are still doing their quiet laps through the air every morning. The universe is weirdly efficient like that. It recycles everything, even sovereignty, into background noise. There is a soft, dry comedy in this. A forgotten island kingdom swallowed by rising seas might live on only as the awkward last name of the person who fixes your internet. An ancient river kingdom, once at the center of time for its own tiny multiverse of fishermen and scribes, might survive as the label on a regional cheese. Not evil, not even tragic, just the way existence misplaces its paperwork. And in this video of your own life, you speak these remnants all the time, without noticing. You give directions using the bones of dead realms. You write addresses that are, secretly, tiny memorials. Every time you say, turn left after the old bridge, or I live near the market hill, you might be reciting the last spell of a kingdom that no longer knows it exists. Pattern interrupt. You do not have to believe any of this right now. You can let it drift, but after you wake, if you feel like following a small harmless wish, you might look up the origin of your town's name. Just once. See what old stories have been hiding in plain sight on your street signs. Because in the next stretch of this slow descent, we'll follow those names inward and imagine what it felt like to fall asleep inside them while they were still alive. The last light in the window, imagining the final night of a small kingdom. So let's start with a window. Just one. A square of lantern light floating above a river that folds around a bend like a sleeping animal. The hill above it wears a modest wall, more comfort than fortress, and below the harbour is only a stone lip with a few wooden boats tied up, nudging one another in the dark. This is a kingdom. It rules a valley, a crossing, a single crooked street that pretends to be a capital. Here is the thing. Tonight is its last night as a kingdom, and nothing looks particularly impressed about that. No invading army, no smoke on the horizon, just carts in the lower square loaded with chests and jars and a suspicious number of chickens waiting for morning. The river has been changing its mind for years, slipping away from the old trade route, and tomorrow the officials will ride downstream to a newer, brighter town. The crown will travel in a saddlebag. The capital will stay here. In a narrow room above the square, a scribe is packing away tablets and brittle rolls of ink-marked reed. He pauses over one clay tablet with the royal name impressed along the edge, presses his thumb into the margin, not to add a word, just to feel that the marks are real. He could record this moment. He doesn't. He wraps the tablet with the others and ties the bundle shut. The history ends a little early, by choice, because he is tired and because the universe does not require a closing line. On the hilltop wall, a guard leans on his spear and takes one last slow look. He traces the familiar circuit, the bend of the river, the 3 roof tiles that never matched, the fig tree that somehow grew out of a crack in the gate tower. He is not watching for enemies. He is watching for memory. Tomorrow he will walk away, and this view will become a private myth he carries around in a different reality. Think about that for a second. A capital city, downgraded to a story in one person's head. In a dim courtyard, a child sits on a trunk, while adults argue gently about blankets. Someone crouches to explain that they are going to live somewhere new, somewhere bigger, where no one knows how to pronounce the old kingdom's name. The child asks if they will still be princes here, in the small sense of knowing every alley cat and shortcut. No, not really. But they can wish for new alleys. We're going to stay with that window for a moment, because inside it, the kingdom is both fully alive and already a memory. The last lamp on the palace balcony burns low, the wax collapsing in on itself while the flame stands tall, pretending not to notice the rules of its own existence. That is this whole place, a candle at the center of time for a tiny multiverse of people, still giving light, even as the wax runs out. There is no decree declaring the end. There is only a door left unbarred, a key set on a table, ledgers closed but not locked. The harbour ropes will rub through someday, and the boats will drift. The wall will lose a stone, then 2, then a corner, and centuries from now, someone might walk along the river and see only a curve in the land, never realizing they've stepped through the ghost of a capital. In that specifically Adventure Time way, this unnoticed fade-out is its own quiet kind of cosmic comedy. As you drift off, hold that window in your mind, the last light, the last night, the exact breath where a kingdom stops being the center of a universe and becomes just another place on a map. In the next stretch, we'll follow what happens after the light goes out, how the ruins, the names, and the half-remembered wishes keep working on time long after everyone has gone to sleep. What remains when names are gone? the deep patterns of human placemaking. And here is the thing. When that last light goes out, when a kingdom slips from being the center of a universe to a smudge on some future map, reality doesn't stop. The pattern keeps running, like a quiet background process in the multiverse, looping the same ancient script with new actors and slightly different stage lighting. Let's start by zooming out over everything we've walked through tonight. Riverside capitals that bloomed where the current slowed just enough to build a harbor, then drowned under silt when the river changed its mind. Hilltop citadels gripping one narrow mountain pass, living off tolls and watchfires until someone carved a new road through a different valley. Desert oases that were once the center of time for caravans, then slowly choked by dunes when the rains shifted and the trade routes bent away. Island harbors that felt like the edge of the universe, erased by storms, rising seas, or one bad volcanic wish from the planet itself. Modest city-states that were basically very serious neighborhoods, with crowns fading into misread maps and legends. Different climates, different gods, different rules about who gets to wear which hat. Same underlying move. We're going to see it again and again. People clustering around water and crossroads, because that is where survival has the highest probability. They pile up walls, not because they love stone, but because they hate surprise. They sketch markets into the dust, turn pathways into timelines of desire and trade, and then tell stories to explain why this exact bend in the river is the center of time. Until it isn't. Think about that for a second. A kingdom ends, but the behaviors don't. There is always someone looking for the next spring, the next pass, the next harbor that feels like an answer. They are not evil. They are not even especially visionary. They are just bound by the same quiet power that shaped the first villages. The impulse to gather, to trade, to defend, to belong. Names change, borders breathe in and out like lungs. The core script of existence barely flinches, and this is where it folds back to you. The place you live, your city, your suburb, your small town with the one late-night gas station, it is not outside this pattern. Your apartment block is just a vertical village. Your commute is a trade route. The glowing convenience store at the corner is a modern oasis, humming under fluorescent stars instead of desert ones. You are walking through a living experiment in human placemaking that has been running for thousands of years. If that sounds cosmic, it is, but in that specifically Adventure Time way, where the universe is huge and strange, and also wearing pajamas. Recognizing the pattern doesn't make everything feel doomed. It makes it feel connected. Your skyline is not a final answer. It is a current draft. And even if, far in some other timeline, your streets fade and your neighborhood's name becomes a trivia question no one remembers to ask, the deeper wish keeps echoing. Somewhere, people will still be drawing circles of light against the dark and calling them home. In the next section, we'll bring that all the way down to your pillow, tracing how your own nightly rituals mirror those ancient walls, markets, and crossroads, and how, even as you fall asleep, you're quietly helping decide what kind of kingdom this moment in time will become. You, here, now seeing your life between memory and forgetting. So let's start right here, where you are. Not in some desert oasis realm swallowed by dunes, not in a hilltop citadel erased by landslides and time, but in your bed, in your room, in this very small corner of the universe where your body is quietly orbiting sleep. Here is the thing, you already live in a kingdom, it just doesn't have walls or banners. Your routines are the roads of it, the paths you walk so often that they've worn invisible grooves into your days. The way you move from bed to kitchen in the morning, from door to street, from work to home, that is your road system, your trade network, your tiny personal center of time. Your relationships are its trade routes. Messages, glances, shared jokes, arguments that resolve, and arguments that don't. Little caravans of attention moving back and forth. Think about that for a second. Every text you send is like a ship leaving your harbor, loaded with a wish for connection, hoping the weather in someone else's reality is calm enough to receive it. There are wells and harbors too. The chair you always sit in. The cafe table that has quietly seen 5 years of your life. The patch of sidewalk where you always notice the sky. These are your oases, the places that refill you, even if all they're giving you is 10 seconds of not being in a hurry. In that specifically Adventure Time way, they're low-budget, everyday versions of magical springs. And just like the river kingdoms that vanished when the water shifted a few miles, your kingdom is built on currents you don't control. A job changes, a friend moves away, a favorite shop closes, the road moves, the harbor silts up, and some part of your map becomes legend. One day you say, "I used to go there all the time," and you're already talking like an archaeologist. Most of this will not be widely remembered. That is not an insult. That is the rule of existence. Whole island kingdoms were lost to rising seas and storms, leaving behind only misread maps and half-remembered stories. So of course a Tuesday in your life will not echo loudly in the multiverse. Why would it? But we're going to gently flip that, because obscurity is not failure. It's a kind of freedom. The value of a harbor is not measured by how many chronicles mention it, but by how many lives quietly docked there and felt safe for a while. Your power is not in being permanent. It's in being present. Right now, your bed is a throne and a ship and a border gate. The room around you is layered over older rooms, older fields, older fires. Beneath your town, pressed into the earth like old letters under new ones, there are forgotten city-states and unnamed farms, all sharing the same coordinates in time with you, just on different layers of the timeline. You, here, now, breathing, existing in this tiny kingdom that will one day be a soft blur, and that is okay. Let your roads go quiet for the night. Let the trade routes close. In the next section, we'll drift even deeper into that quiet, following your kingdom as it dims its lanterns and hands the night over to dreams, letting the kingdoms rest, a gentle farewell to the forgotten. So now the roads are quiet. The lanterns are dim. Those candles on the edge of empires we talked about at the very beginning. The tiny flames in river bends and on cliffside harbors and in little hilltop citadels have burned low. And you and I have walked past most of them together tonight. We've stood in silted harbors where the river abandoned its own port. We've climbed to mountain micro-kingdoms erased by landslides and time. We've watched desert oasis realms swallowed by dunes and rerouted desire. Here is the thing. For a little while in this video, they came back. Not as perfect reconstructions, not as exact coordinates in the multiverse, but as soft outlines in the dark, as if reality itself briefly remembered a few lost save files and loaded them just long enough for you to pass through. A hill kingdom that once taxed a narrow pass, an island court that measured its power in fishing nets and storm seasons, a city-state that lived on as a misread map and an argument between two archaeologists. Think about that for a second. We're going to do something gentle now. We're going to let them go. Not with a grand cosmic gesture, not with trumpets at the center of time, but with the quiet bureaucratic efficiency of sleep signing the final paperwork of the day. Thank you, river kingdoms buried under mud and flood. Thank you, dune-swallowed capitals and volcanic islands and wall-ringed valleys that ruled only a single harbor. Thank you for letting your half-remembered existence keep watch while this one tired human drifted closer to rest. It's okay if the names are already blurring. It's okay if you can't quite remember which kingdom fell to drought and which one simply watched its trade route slide a few miles away. Memory is not a loyalty test. The rules of your own mind are looser than any royal charter. And right now, those rules are making room for sleep. Let the crowns made of clay and salt and driftwood dissolve back into the dark. Let the timelines fold, quietly, until each kingdom is just a soft pressure at the edge of awareness. If, in the morning, you don't remember any of this, if the kingdoms feel like someone else's dream you accidentally scrolled through, that's fine. That is their specialty. Some realms only ever existed as a bridge between one moment and the next, between waking and whatever comes after. This time with them was not wasted. It was simply used, like a wish you never needed to say out loud, to move you from one shore of consciousness to another. So you don't have to stay awake for the ending. You don't have to track the lore or hold on to the imagery with any kind of royal discipline. In the next part, I'll speak to the waking version of you about what comes after nights like this. But you don't need to be there if your eyes are heavy. Let the kingdoms dim their last lanterns. Let their walls fade back into the night. You have walked far enough for one universe. Leaving a light in the archive. Soft outro and invitation to return. And as those walls fade, as the last torch in the last forgotten courtyard goes out, here is the thing. We don't have to hold any of it in our hands for it to keep existing. The kingdoms can sleep in the dark. You can sleep in your room. Reality will keep turning the pages of time without asking you to bookmark anything. But if, when you wake up, you want to find your way back here, back to river kingdoms buried under silt, to island realms swallowed by the sea, to hilltop citadels that ruled exactly one stubborn mountain pass, there is an easy, waking world wish you can make. You can like this video, you can subscribe, not as a grand gesture of power, just as a tiny spell you cast so that the algorithm remembers this quiet corner of the universe for you. Think about that for a second. You don't have to remember the title. You don't have to remember my name. You don't even have to remember which forgotten city-state we wandered through before your thoughts drifted sideways. You can let a line of code, somewhere at the center of time of this platform, keep track of it. A small, ongoing archive of quiet stories, waiting like an old harbor at low tide. That's what this channel is trying to be. Not a capital E empire of content, just a shelf of soft universes, catalogued for nights when your brain won't downshift and you need to walk through someone else's ruins for a while. We're going to keep building it out. Desert oasis realms that vanished when the trade routes moved a few miles. Border kingdoms that ruled only one valley and a toll road. Legendary cities that turn out, under the archaeologist's brush, to be very normal towns with very sleepy goats. And if you feel like it, later when you're more awake than you are right now, you can help decide where we go next. In the comments, you can leave the name of a forgotten place you'd like a full bedtime deep dive on. It can be real, a drowned island, a lost river capital, a mountain micro-kingdom that fell with one landslide, or imagined, a city at the bottom of a drained ocean, a crown made of driftwood ruling 3 docks and a fog bank. Collaborative world building as a quiet, low-stakes wish. If you don't write anything, that's fine. If you never tap like, never subscribe, never remember this in the morning, that is also fine. The video has already done its work by keeping you company while the multiverse cooled down around you. You are not failing some cosmic engagement metric. You are just resting. So let's start the ending here. Let your jaw unclench. Let your eyes do that slow, heavy blink that folds one timeline into another. Somewhere in the deep layers of time, ancient river kingdoms, dune-buried capitals, cliffside forts, and island thrones are sleeping alongside you. Crowns off, lights out. May your night be long enough. May your dreams be gentle, and may you always know that, whenever you need it, there is a small, quiet archive of forgotten kingdoms, waiting for you to return.